This took place during the early 1990s. I was 10 or 11 at the time. My family and I lived in a rural area near Kansas City. This particular area is very different nowadays compared to what it was in the 90s. Back in the day, it had a very country-like atmosphere. We lived off of a gravel road, and traffic was very sporadic. Typically, the only people who drove down our road were the people who lived there, and there were only a few houses on our street at the time. Across the street from the house that we moved into was a cornfield with a few trees beside the road. There were a couple of boys my age who lived in the same neighborhood, and we all thought it would be fun to build a treehouse or a fort of some kind. I was across the street almost every day. My friends would usually walk to my house, and then we would go across the street to play in the fort. Think of that scene in the 1990 miniseries of Stephen King's It, where the Losers Club was building that dam in the river outside of Derry. Yep, it was a lot like that. One day, I was across the street with one of the other boys. We noticed a small blue car driving up and down the street, slowly. Since our road was very narrow and gravelly, it wasn't unusual for cars to drive down it slowly. But this car in particular was driving extremely slow. I noticed that the driver would look out his window and sort of eyeball us every time that he drove by. I saw him at least 2 or 3 more times that afternoon. I remember thinking that he was probably curious about our playhouse, or that he was lost and was contemplating on asking us for directions. After a while, my friend had to take off, leaving me there all by myself. Not long after my friend had left, I saw that same blue car driving down our street once again, but this time he came to a stop. The driver just sat there and stared at me for a while, and I got this uneasy feeling about him. Even at that age, I knew all about stranger danger. I began to feel like something bad was going to happen. I could hear my dad's words echoing in my head. If a stranger tries to grab you, you run as fast as you can and scream your head off. I started thinking about which direction to run off to. I knew that if I ran off in the opposite direction, that I would be running into a cornfield that was at least a mile wide in every direction. If I ran towards my house, I would have to cross the street, meaning that I would have to pass the creepy guy in the car. The situation terrified me, and I could feel my heartbeat escalating as I decided what the hell I should do. While deciding which direction would give me my best chance of escaping, I saw the guy reach down for something. I never saw what he was reaching for, but something told me that if I didn't take off in that moment, I would be history. I then saw the driver's side door open just a crack. I knew that my dad was home at the time, so I decided to make a break for it. I knew that I was going to have to cross the street and make it past the man's car. So I began running as fast as I could alongside the road opposite of where the man's car was facing. I could see out of the corner of my eye that the man had closed his driver's side door. When I got to the road, the driver put his car in reverse. If I had been a second slower, I wouldn't have made it. The trunk of his car barely missed me as I darted across the street and into my driveway. I began screaming as loud as I could as I ran towards my house. My dad immediately came outside and met me in the driveway. When I turned around to show my dad the man in the car, he was gone. All I could see was a cloud of dust rising off the gravel road as the man in the blue car sped out of there. That night I had a nightmare. I was running down a seemingly endless gravel road, panting, sweating, terrified. I will look back to see a blue car getting closer and closer. I woke up my parents. Apparently I had been yelling in my sleep. I had to sleep in their room for a while, but eventually the night terrors did stop. This happened nearly 2 decades ago, but I can still remember it very well. I have no doubt in my mind that the man in the blue car was the monster that your parents would tell you about when you were a kid. Had I not ran off when I did, I would likely be nothing but a statistic today. I would occasionally hear stories about other kids who went missing in my area during the 90s, and I would often wonder if the man in the blue car had anything to do with it. But now I understand why my dad always told me to run and scream, and someday I'll be instructing my own kids to do the same. I had always been told that it was never a good idea to go to the local park at night. I've heard many stories about that place, ranging from homeless people getting into loud altercations to bystanders being assaulted and even robbed. I have to admit that I didn't take these stories seriously and would often go to the park after dark. Normally, I would walk through the park after finishing my lifeguard shift at the community pool. It was a part of my routine, and it always seemed like I was the only one there. Whenever I would make my way through the park, I always noticed the unmistakable smell of marijuana, even though no one was in sight. It was a bit odd, but I brushed it off, not really giving it much thought. On the night in question, I was casually strolling through the park and was approaching the area where I would usually smell the cannabis, and I saw a tall silhouette trailing behind me. I couldn't tell if the figure was a man or a woman because of the distance, but I was creeped out nonetheless. I then saw that the assailant was wearing a V for Vendetta mask, a short skirt, and was brandishing a knife. At this point, my heart was pounding. I then heard the masked figure let out an agonizing scream. The scream didn't sound like it was a female. It sounded like a deranged man. Regardless of what this person identified as, they were wearing a mask and holding a knife and screaming like a fucking psychopath, and I assumed the worst. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. The figure gave chase, picking up their pace once I started running. Once I got to the front door of my house, I nervously fiddled through my pockets, trying to look for my keys. I was in too much panic that I realized that I left my keys in my backpack. I eventually gave up trying to find the keys and started pounding on the door loudly. My dad got angry when he heard the racket, but he understood my sense of urgency once I explained things to him. I can unequivocally say that the 30 seconds I spent waiting by my front door was the longest 30 seconds of my life. I should have listened to the warnings about walking through that park at night. A lesson lived is a lesson learned. This happened back in October of 2016, at the height of the killer clown craze that was going on back then. At the time, I thought nothing of it. It was just a bunch of teenagers looking for a quick laugh by frightening others. I lived alone in a 2-story house. There's about a 3-mile walk between the neighboring houses. It's all separated by tall grass and forest. This detail will be important later on. Halloween night came around, and I was watching Friday the 13th in the living room. The front of the house has a large window overlooking the lawn. It was about 10:55 when Mrs. Voorhees was getting her head chopped off, in the film, and that's when I heard a small but noticeable knock at the window. It made me jump a bit. What the hell? I went over to the window and pulled the curtains back, but all I could see outside was darkness. 10 minutes later, I'm getting ready for bed when I hear a knock at the front door. Now the front door has these long panels of blurred glass. I looked through and saw nothing but darkness. However, a red object appeared in the corner. Wondering what it could be, I changed my angle of view. And I kid you not, there was a fucking clown standing adjacent to my front door, staring right back at me. I jumped back in surprise as the clown fully pressed his face up to the glass. I saw that the clown had a knife in his hand. I grabbed my cell phone to dial 911, and that's when he started pounding on the glass. Hard enough to eventually break it. I ran up the stairs, locked my bedroom door, and got ready to call the police when an incoming call came in from my closest neighbor. Now the phone service in my area is pretty bad. The 2 bedrooms and the bathroom in my house are the only places that you can get good service. I answered the phone, but I couldn't make out anything that my neighbor was saying. His voice was coming in patchy and glitchy. He apparently was in a bad spot for phone service. He said something along the lines that someone just broke into his house. The call then disconnected. I quickly dialed 911 and told him what was going on. As I was on the phone, I heard the shattering of glass from downstairs. The dispatch informed me to stay locked in the room until the police came. I then heard footsteps coming up my stairs, shortly followed by pounding on my bedroom door. That went on for what felt like hours until I heard police sirens outside. The clown then shouted in a creepy, strained voice,
"Oh, you fucker. You just wait."
A flurry of footsteps descended the stairs and out the back door. I came out of the room and met with the officers. I explained everything to them, and how I had received an odd phone call from my neighbor. As I was talking to the officers, my neighbor actually came over. What he told us shocked me. He said that when he called me before, he was trying to warn me that a clown had broken into his house and ran off in the direction of my house. The good news is that the cops ended up catching the clown during their search of the backyard. They brought him around front and placed him into one of the cruisers. They said that they found 2 kitchen knives and a loaded Glock 17 on him. The scariest thing about this encounter is how the clown got to my house so quickly without a vehicle. He left my neighbors at 11:03 and got to my house at 11:05. The next day I got a bunch of texts from an unknown number saying that I was going to die. Since the perpetrator was locked up at this time, I'm guessing that it was an acquaintance of his, which makes me wonder if he acted alone that night. Nothing has happened since, but one thing is for sure. I fucking hate clowns. This happened back in 2012 when I was still attending college. Me and a few friends of mine opted to band together and rent out a 1-bedroom apartment near the campus. We were a bunch of party animals back then, and we wanted our own place, so we could indulge in that lifestyle without worrying about our parents or the school's administration. The apartment complex was located in a rather unsavory part of town. The cops were called out there at least once a week to break up fights or to respond to reports of break-ins. All we ever did there was shower and sleep. Having to overhear domestic disputes and arguing through the walls was just part of the deal. One night my roommates went to a party while I stayed behind to study for an upcoming exam. Aside from some Tupac playing somewhere in the upper levels, things were pretty quiet. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard a strange sound coming from the hallway outside the front door. It sounded like a large metal object being dragged across the concrete floor. There was also a muffled noise, like someone was saying something, although I couldn't quite make out any words. This went on for about 10 minutes, before there came a loud smashing sound. It was at this point that I got up and made my way over to the peephole. At first I didn't see anything, so I just waited to see if anyone would pass by my door. About a minute later, a figure came into view and stood between my door and the door opposite. It was a Caucasian male. Now I will list 3 things that instantly made every alarm bell in my head go off. The man wasn't wearing a shirt and was completely drenched in sweat. There was a large axe in the man's right hand that he was dragging behind him. And last but not least, this deranged individual had on a black leather gas mask that completely hid his face. I was awestruck. This is the kind of thing that you see in low-budget horror movies. This kind of shit doesn't happen in real life. It was a complete shock to the system. As if reading my mind, a creepy, muffled voice then began singing.
Come with me, Hail Mary, run quick, see. What do we have here now? Do you wanna ride or die? La da da da, la 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 la.
As soon as the man finished the verse, he lifted his left leg and heaved the axe into my door. The movement was so fast, it caused me to topple backward. As soon as I scrambled to my feet, I heard another voice from further down the hallway.
Hey, what the fuck are you doing?
I rushed back to the peephole. The masked man was now gone. To the left of my front door was a fire escape, where he was able to make a quick getaway. I then saw the apartment security guard step into view with his taser drawn. "Hey, do you want me to call the police?" I shouted through the door.
"Yeah, if you don't mind. I'm going back outside to cut him off."
I immediately called the police and explained the situation to them. Unfortunately, the masked man managed to evade both the security guard and the police. The complex was surrounded by a small forest, and there was just too many ways for him to escape. After the lease was up, I moved out of that hellhole. A lunatic pacing up and down the hallway outside my door, wearing a gas mask and dragging an axe behind him, while singing a creepy-ass rendition of a Tupac song, was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a terrifying experience, but I can look back on it now and laugh. I hope you've enjoyed my story. And stay safe out there, guys. This happened to me when I was in 4th grade. I am now 42. The internet as we know it wasn't around back in those days. So unfortunately, I don't have any news articles to corroborate my story. But I have a very vivid memory of what happened that day. The day that my friend nearly lost her innocence and possibly her life. Here is the backstory. I have always had this very weird habit that I still do to this very day. I don't know what causes it, but I've always walked on my tiptoes. When I would go to school, I would usually get picked on a lot for this. No matter how much I tried walking flat-footed, I always ended up back on my toes. This led my family to believe that I was destined to be a ballet dancer. As much as I love to dance, I was also a tomboy that preferred climbing trees to wearing dresses. So when my mother, who worked 2 jobs, took me to the community center and signed me up for ballet classes, I thought I would definitely have to learn how to like dresses. The dance instructor's name was Mulaney. She was impressed by my skills but wasn't crazy about my height or my parents' economic status, as this was a very expensive class. At the end of my audition, I was told that I was too tall and awkward. It was a nice way of building up a young girl's confidence. When I exited the classroom and entered the hallway, I heard Mulaney say under her breath that she would not teach poor kids. I stopped mid-stride and turned around. "Excuse me?" And that's when she replied, "I don't teach trailer trash, okay?" My face became so red that my ears were purple. At that moment, I decided that I would knock her on her pompous ass. Before I could react, that's when I felt a hand on my shoulder, followed by a man's voice. "That's a fighter in you. Have you ever thought about trying out karate?" Mr. Diaz was a well-known and respected karate instructor in our county. He wanted me to try out his class and even offered to take me in at no charge. I would be his first girl, but he saw my potential, and I still owe him a lot for this. When I first started training, he noticed my tiptoed footing, and rather than mock me for it, he showed me how to turn them into weapons, as my legs are, to this day, still solid muscle from my calves to my thighs, and I kick harder than a mule. It was around this time that our small town on the coast of North Carolina was being terrorized by a man who had been abducting young girls. He would take them, have his way with them, and when he was done, he would bind their hands together, blindfold them before crossing into another town and dropping them off in the middle of the night. He was a sick bastard. He didn't kill any of his victims, but his MO suggested that he was becoming more and more violent with each incident. Mr. Diaz changed his lessons for a week or two and taught us how to use our momentum against attackers to get away. Eyes, nose, groin, and face. He said that if you were attacked, we should try our best to claw and scratch their face and eyes. Not only would this have the chance of blinding them, but it would also make them easy to identify after the fact. More importantly, he emphasized the buddy system. He told us not to scream the R word, because unfortunately, while many people want to stop that from happening, he also said people don't want to see it, and carry that mental image around in their heads. We should scream, "Fire," or "I lost my arm." He said that as silly as the last one sounds, it works. People are compelled to look at a fire, but even more so if someone's arm is falling off. Okay, so now on to the day in question. I was in 4th grade, and the year was 1990, springtime. At the time, I was with my best friend, who we'll call Ginny. Ginny and I decided to take a little walk around the neighborhood we lived in. This neighborhood had 2 main entrances and formed a circle with 2 parallel streets in the middle. Homes were lined along each road, no more than 1.5 acres apart, some even closer. It was very easy to come into one entrance, leave out the other, and not be seen by anyone, even if you were paying attention to the vehicles that were passing through. This was also back when we kept the time by looking at the streetlights. The rule was when the streetlights come on, your ass better be on your way home. Ginny and I were on the main road heading towards the back. We were just being a couple of young girls talking about boys that we liked and the boogeyman that had been terrorizing our state. A girl that we knew named Kelly had been the latest victim. She was turned from a social butterfly into a psych ward irregular. She even tried to take her own life at one point. As we were talking about this, I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing an unfamiliar car approaching us very slowly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The car was a Pontiac with a faded maroon or burgundy color. The driver almost reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer. He wore these thick, red-rimmed glasses, had tight blonde, curly hair, and had a smile that made my skin crawl. His window was down already, and he stopped the car beside us. "Hello, girls. I'm trying to pay my electric bill, and I can't seem to find the office anywhere. Can you tell me how to get there from here?" Coincidentally, the one electric company in our town wasn't even a mile away from our neighborhood. In fact, I could have walked straight through the woods and shown up at the front doorstep. The only way to pay to turn on the service was in the office itself. Again, this was a small town back in the early 90s. The driver continued, saying that he had to get there to avoid his electricity shutting off. Knowing that he had to have been there before, I stated, "It's where you paid to have it turned on, so just go there." That's when I noticed an open map beside him on the passenger seat. He explained that his mother had been the one to turn on the electricity, and he was new to the area and had just come back from deployment. Something that struck me as odd was that his hair was a bit too long for being in the military, and he didn't have a sticker for getting on base. There are 2 military bases by us, Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point. Both of my grandfathers served in the military. Can you please just show me it here on the map?" He beckoned Ginny over to his car. Ginny was obviously unaware that something was off. I looked around and saw that no one was outside, and I quickly turned my attention back to Ginny and the man. The voice of Mr. Diaz echoed in my head. "Fight if you can't fly. Something bad will happen to Ginny if you don't." As soon as Ginny gets close enough, a look of pure evil forms on the man's face. Imagine seeing a human transforming into a demonic creature. That's the best way I can describe it. "Thanks, sweetie. Just point it out for me right here." He locks eyes with mine and gives me a sickly smile. That's when I quickly grab Ginny. "Wait! Don't lean in!" Jenny's scream echoed across the street as I look up and saw that the man had reached over the passenger seat and had a hold of her arm. The car slowly began to roll forward as he struggled to pull her in. I yelled as I wrapped my arms around Jenny's upper body. I then pulled back as hard as I could, and I knew it was going to hurt like a bitch once I fell onto the asphalt, but that was okay, as long as I still had a hold of Ginny. We both hit the road, and it hurt like hell, as I predicted. By this time, some of the neighbors heard us screaming and had exited their homes. I pulled Ginny to safety as the car peeled away. One of the bystanders was the mother of my friend Brandon. She got the tags, and a detailed description of what the driver looked like and his car. The man that we encountered that day was the monster who had been preying on young girls in North Carolina. I don't recall his name. My mother made every effort to keep me sheltered before this incident, and it just got worse after this. Now that I'm a mother myself, I can understand better now. She was proud of me and my actions that day. Ginny was also very grateful, and I'm glad to say that she's still doing well. The girl that I mentioned earlier, Kelly, serves as an example of what could have become of her if I hadn't intervened that day. Kelly has had a rough life and doesn't really speak to anyone anymore. I don't know all the details, but the monster ended up being caged. The descriptions of the car and the driver gathered from my neighborhood aided in his apprehension. I often think back to that day at the community center, where I was scoffed at by someone who thought I wasn't worth the investment. But against all odds, Mr. Diaz saw the potential in a tall, awkward girl who walked on her tiptoes. He was the guiding voice in my head that day, and if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been able to save Ginny. This took place when I was only 7 years old. Back then, my parents would always drop me off at my grandma's house on the weekends. I always looked forward to staying with her. We would always go for walks around the neighborhood and talk to the people that she knew. My grandmother was always a very religious person, and we went to church with many of the people in her neighborhood. It was a very friendly community. They would often host garage sales on the weekends during the warmer months, which usually had decent turnouts. On one weekend, my parents decided to go to one of the garage sales with us. I was super excited. We usually just liked to look around and rarely would buy anything. Eventually, we got to a house that had boxes of toys lined all the way down the driveway. The sale was happening at a house that we had never been to before, and we didn't know who lived there. Once I saw all the toys, I thought I had just won the lottery. While I was busy sorting through the newly discovered treasure, my grandma and parents were a few yards away looking at some dishes and furniture and making conversation with some of the other people there. An older man, who looked to be around 60, approached me and watched me sort through the boxes with a smile on his face.
My, what a pretty young woman you are. Do you like toys?
I eagerly said yes, not thinking anything of it. I was about to leave to go ask my mom if I could buy a toy horse that I found. But before I could go, he said that he would let me have it for free and gave it to me with a grin on his face. He started picking a few other toys out of the boxes and handing them over to me, insisting that I could have all the toys I wanted. He told me that he had way more toys inside of his house that I could play with as well, and that I should go with him. Before I knew it, I was being led into his house. My mom then came up behind me and pulled me away from him, and then asked what the hell was going on. She was furious, holding me tightly and staring daggers at the man. She must have seen what was happening just in time and intervened. My dad and grandma were right behind her. The man said nothing while my mom and grandma started screaming at him, and this caught the attention of every other bystander, and everyone was immediately suspicious. I don't remember what was said, because my dad scooped me up in his arms and took me back to the car. I remember my grandma calling the police before we left. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation at the time. I found out many years later that the man had gone to the same church as my grandma and had participated in a lot of the events hosted by the church, including the youth events. Apparently, the police found loads of child pornography on his computer and was sent to prison shortly after. I'm 19 now, and it still creeps me out thinking about what could have happened to me if my mother didn't see what was going on. Thank God she did. Back in 2001, I worked for a major home improvement warehouse. Let's just say the company I worked for had a thing for the color orange. By then, I had been with the company for about 8 years. My previous position was with HR, an assistant to the regional and store managers. The company eliminated that position, so I asked to be transferred to the RTV department, which stands for Return to Vendor. The girl who was working in that position gave her 2 weeks' notice, so the timing was perfect. The job was to work with the different vendors to get credit back to the store for defective merchandise. Our company had a pretty liberal return policy back in 2001, and some people brought back some strange things like garbage disposal units infested with maggots, old plug-in drills that weren't even being manufactured, you could always tell by the serial numbers, defective lawnmowers, and half-put-together shelves. I've seen it all. My RTV cage, as they called it, was located in the receiving department at the back of the store. It was a 12-foot-high chain-link fence with a swinging door entrance, which I would lock when I would go on lunch break or checked out for the day. I had my computer up on a makeshift stand, where I would process the credits and have vendors sign off on them. You wouldn't be able to see into the cage from outside due to all the bins holding the defective merchandise. One day, a vendor came in for some defective molding. I was standing at my computer with my back towards the guy as he inspected the merchandise, both the product and mine apparently. He then told me, "I'll give you credit for everything here." I was about to turn around and say, "Awesome, thanks," but was surprised with a flesh-colored, wrinkled, phallic-shaped hardware hanging out of his zipper, and he just stood there with his hands on his hips so that I knew it didn't just fall out. I turned around back to my computer, and I felt faint. I thought, did that just happen? Without turning back around, I handed him the RTV paper to sign, and he said, "See you in a couple weeks." I took some time in the cage to compose myself, and then walked to the manager's office and informed him about the situation. I also called the MOD, they like their acronyms, and his reply was, "Well, what do you expect?" And then started laughing. Since this was 20 years ago, I'll go ahead and say that I was pretty cute back then. Tan, fit, always had my hair and makeup done. No matter what I looked like, I didn't expect that from someone I had to do business with. The MOD insinuated that I should expect and accept treatment like that from time to time, and they weren't going to do anything about it. I called the company that the hot dog flasher worked for, and they said, "We'll look into it." Fast forward a few weeks later, and a coworker approached me and asked, "Did you hear? That molding dude did the same thing to a cashier. Now he can't come back into the store anymore." So, that son of a bitch didn't get fired? Apparently not. Looking back on this whole thing, I should have fucking sued them. I'd probably be rich by now. Maybe I should have just laughed and said, "That's all you've got? I've seen bigger ones on newborn babies." But hindsight is always 20/20. In the moment, I froze, because that was the last thing I ever expected to happen. In 8th grade, my innocence felt like it was taken from me. I was only 12 when the school year began, and I was already accustomed to being more mature than my peers, since I practically raised my 4-year-old sister. I had to fulfill parental responsibilities like cooking and cleaning, etc. I also wasn't good at saying no or putting my foot down. Me being too kind caused me problems in my life, which I will mention shortly. There was a special needs boy who I'll call Carl, who attended 3 of my 6 daily classes. Whenever anything involved a partner, teachers would always pair me up with Carl. I didn't mind, because I disliked how rude my classmates were to him sometimes. It wasn't his fault both he and his twin brother were born with Down syndrome. He was actually a very nice kid, and always had interesting facts about any given subject. This is where the long history of my stalker experience begins. You see, Carl had a teacher's aide assigned to him. I will call him Matthew. So since I was already partnered with Carl, I decided I would also be friendly towards Matthew as well. This is a decision that I would come to regret. Matthew was 29 at the time. Again, let me remind you that I was only 12. After about 3 months into the school year, I was getting along great with Matthew and Carl. All was going fine until one of the more popular girls in my grade asked me randomly in front of everyone why Matthew was always touching me. I told her I had no clue what she was referring to, and 2 other girls chimed in and backed her up, telling me to pay more attention over the next few days, and I did. I started to realize that Matthew always had a hand either on my shoulder or back, sometimes my lower back. This made me extremely uncomfortable, because I had never even realized how hands-on Matthew was until now. One day I told him to stop when his hand was way too close to my right breast. This occurred during the final class of the day. My exact words were, "Matthew, please don't touch me." It was like if I had cursed his ancestors or something, because he flipped out, pulling away his hand as if I had burnt it. He then waited for the teacher to walk in, then yelled at me in front of everyone. "You've changed! You need to grow up! I thought you were different!" He then stormed out of the room, almost knocking over the teacher in the process. The teacher followed him outside, and as soon as the door shut behind him, everyone turned their head towards me and asked me what I had done to set him off like that. I told them exactly what I said to Matthew. Even Carl, who saw the whole thing, defended me. What I had least expected was even the popular girls in my class took pity on me. They said if I got into trouble because of this, they would say something to the teachers. The teacher came back in and asked me what happened, and I told her what transpired. The teacher wouldn't believe me, even though I had never given her problems before and was always a straight A student. That day was the first of many awful days to come. Matthew began demanding why I had changed so abruptly and started trying to pretend nothing had happened, and proceeded to still touch my shoulders and back. I stood my ground every time, especially since my classmates were there to back me up. Eventually, it escalated to where he would randomly wait for the teacher to walk in and then start yelling at me. Even during lunch, he would go looking for me on the campus and try to talk to me. It was all very awkward having to deal with him. How he managed to become a teacher's aide is beyond me. I began hanging out with the other staff in the office to get away from this unhinged weirdo. He attempted his harassment there, until the front desk lady noticed that I was visibly uncomfortable, and even overheard me telling him not to touch me. She immediately hauled ass to get him away from me, and from that point on, the office was a safe area. The straw that broke the camel's back was the day that I struggled to pack all of my things into my school bag, so I wouldn't be stuck alone in the classroom with Matthew. He took advantage of my predicament and cornered me in the back of the classroom. I failed to mention this before, but Matthew was 6'4". I was mortified and tried to scream, but because of my panicked state, I couldn't. Matthew glared at me and placed his hands on my shoulders. Before he could say anything, there came a voice from the doorway. "Hey, what's going on back there?" I then took that opportunity to book it out of there. The next day, my science teacher asked me what happened. She had her detention slip waiting for me, but wanted to hear my side of the story first. I told her that Matthew had been touching me, and I wanted him to stop, and no one seemed to be doing anything about it. She saw that I was visibly shaken and on the verge of tears, and then said the only reason that she wasn't going to give me detention was because she wanted me to return to my old self. Not because of what I told her about Matthew. I was beyond belief at this point. I had told multiple members of the school staff about what Matthew had been doing, and none of them were doing a damn thing about it. They wanted to sweep it under the rug and pretend that everything was just fine. This continued on for months, and yet not one teacher did anything to defend me. My grades began to slip. I went from a straight A student to an average C. My parents were furious at me when my report card came in. I finally broke down and tried to tell my dad the truth, but he wasn't having any of it, and slammed the door to his room in my face. I then went to my mom and told her everything that was happening at school. Finally, an adult listened to what I was saying, and my mom hauled ass to the school the next day and raised hell. They immediately escorted her to the principal's office. I'm not sure what happened from there, but from what my mom mentioned, she got into a screaming match with the principal about my situation, and some of the staff members came forward and backed up my character. Before all this started happening, I didn't have the reputation of being a problematic student. Unfortunately, Carl was removed from all of my classes. I heard stories from some of the other students that Matthew would belittle and reprimand Carl whenever he failed at an assignment. Matthew's conduct eventually caught up with him, and he was ultimately fired. He did the same thing to another female student, and it became impossible to ignore. Matthew disappeared for about a year after that. I remember one day that I was shopping at the local mall with my father when out of the corner of my eye, I saw Matthew crouching behind something, trying to do his best to stay out of sight. The sight of him freaked me out, and I began telling my dad frantically that I was being stalked. However, by the time that my dad went to go investigate, Matthew had vanished. Fast forward to my junior year. My mom was part of an adult soccer team, and I would sometimes go and watch them play. During one of her matches, one of her teammates brought along a person to spectate. It had been a couple of years since I last saw Matthew, but once I made eye contact with this man, there was no mistake. It was him. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole the moment I recognized him. I quickly excused myself and hauled ass out of there. Thank goodness my dad and a bunch of other people were there, or Matthew might have just picked up where he left off years before. A couple of years went by. It was now the fall semester of my second year in college. I had pretty much moved on from Matthew at this point, and was making progress and trusting adults again. One day I was heading to class when I noticed a group of men lounging in the quad area of the campus. As I got closer, I froze in place because one of the men looked very familiar to me. When we made eye contact, there was no doubt in my mind that it was Matthew. I quickly rushed past, hoping that I was just seeing old ghosts. However, I would not be so lucky. The stalking began again. Matthew would circle me like a shark wherever I went. Whenever I would look out an adjacent window during class, he would be standing somewhere off in the distance, looking directly at me. Whenever I found myself walking down a hallway alone, a chill would creep up my spine. I would look behind me, and there he was, peeking out at me from around the corner. One day, he followed me into the cafeteria and methodically sat at a table next to me. Thankfully, I was with a group of friends. He began eating a slice of half-eaten pizza someone left behind, and was staring directly at me the whole time, like some kind of animal. I discreetly called for security, and as soon as they arrived, I pointed right at Matthew and told him that this man had been stalking and harassing me. Matthew spit out the pizza and then bolted through an exit door before campus security could confront him. I was embarrassed because everyone in the cafeteria stopped what they were doing to see what was happening. An investigation into Matthew was launched, and the security footage of him roaming the halls corroborated my story and helped me build a case against Matthew to finally get a restraining order against him. Unfortunately, Matthew disappeared once again, and I haven't seen him since that day in the cafeteria. I'm grateful that he's gone, but at the same time, I'm not. Because not knowing what he's up to now is driving me crazy. He could be stalking someone else for all I know. That's a terrifying thought. I wish many times over that I had never befriended Matthew all those years ago. I'm now 24, and I have moved hundreds of miles away from my hometown. If anyone listening is being harassed or stalked, don't wait until it's too late. We all deserve to enjoy our lives carefree from any kind of harassment. I hold no resentment towards those who struggle to tell their story. But this entire ordeal took a toll on my mental health and has made it difficult for me to trust anyone. I'm always looking over my shoulder wherever I go, and I've switched to online-only classes to avoid being on campus. Since I've moved away, I've tried my best to move on. However, I use this experience to teach children the importance of speaking up. Believe me, I know it's hard to even think straight in the heat of the moment, but the more you stay silent, the more the problem will grow and damage you in ways that you can't even fathom. I'm a 17-year-old male from England. When this took place, I was 16, and it was December of last year. Me and my mates live in a small village located about 20 miles south from Manchester. 2 minutes on the train from us was a larger village, which we would frequently visit as we attended school there. And there was also more stuff to do. Our small village didn't really offer much for a bunch of amped up 16-year-olds. There was this old abandoned office building in the larger village that was about a 5 to 10 minute walk from the village center where all the shops were. The old office building was quite creepy to look at night. Each floor was the same, a huge office space to the right of a staircase leading to the back stairwell. To the left were the toilets and various other side rooms. We would sneak in through a broken window that we would then cover up, so no other people would know that we were in there. Once in the building, the first thing we did was go up on the roof and get a bird's eye view of the village below. One night, me and 3 of my friends decided to play a game of hide and seek in the old building. The rules were that the seekers had to count on the roof and give the hiders at least 5 minutes before coming down to look for them. After several rounds and changing up teams a couple of times, one friend and I decided that it would be a good plan to hide near the ladder. So when the seekers came down, we would discreetly climb up and hide out on the roof. After successfully making our way up to the roof without being seen, we stayed up there for about a half hour. The 2 seekers eventually got bored of looking for us and came to the roof, where we jumped out and scared them for a laugh. "How long have you guys been up here?" one of them asked. I kept saying that we had been up there the whole time. He looked at me, confused, but didn't say anything else. I thought nothing of it, so we decided to play one more game before heading out. It was now our turn. We started the timer, and the former seekers descended the ladder. Once 5 minutes passed, we began our search. Once we got to the top of the stairs, I looked through one of the big main offices where you could see the back stairs, and I saw one of the hiders walking down them. I thought that I would be sneaky and go down the main stairs and cut them off. But when I got there, they were gone. 15 minutes later, me and my partner were getting bored and a bit creeped out. We knew that they were somewhere in the building because we kept hearing footsteps, doors closing, and what sounded like things being dropped on the floor. We decided to cheat and FaceTimed one of the hiders. When my friend picked up, we were mortified to see Christmas lights outside the building. They had ditched us, and whatever we were hearing wasn't our friends. We immediately hung up and looked at each other before hauling ass out of there. After meeting back up with the other 2, they went on to say that to get back at us for outsmarting them, they thought it would be funny to leave us in the building knowing someone else was definitely in there with us. After calming down because I was utterly pissed off at them, we then all talked about what we saw. My friend explained that when they were trying to find us, they both saw someone on the back stairwell and also heard people talking. They began hearing doors opening and closing and what sounded like random things falling to the floor. When they both realized that we were actually on the roof, that's when they decided to leave and play a prank on us. I responded by telling them that I also saw a figure on the back stairs and how we also heard the exact same things that they did. To this day, I still have no idea what was in there with us. We had been in that building several times before and never had that problem. Thinking that for hours on end, we were playing hide and seek, unaware that something or someone was in there with us, makes me feel sick. The building was demolished a month after this happened, and they plan on replacing it with a housing development. So this has to be the strangest thing that I have ever experienced. At the time, it was very unsettling. I'm from the Bristol area in the southwest region of the United Kingdom, Back in July of 2001, I was working my first job at a local department store while studying for my final GCSE exams. I was 16 at the time. I used my pitiful first month's wages to buy my first mobile phone, a Nokia 3210. At first, everything was pretty normal, and I was enjoying the novelty of communicating while on the move and sending short messages, etc. That was until I started getting random missed calls from the future. I would get these bizarre missed calls, either during my shift or just before it started. When I checked the details, I got the same date and time on every occasion. One missed call, no number, December 31st, 2049. New Year's Eve, nearly 50 years into the future, when I would be 66. These calls always came from a quote, no number. It didn't say unknown number, it said no number. That was unusual, even for cell phones in the early 2000s. Most people I tell this story to try to rationalize this by saying, "Oh, the phone date was just set incorrectly." But I proved this wrong by showing them that the phone was displaying the correct date. I would have chalked this up to a one-off glitch if it had happened only once, but I lost count after this happened at least 13 times over the space of a month. On the 11th time it happened, I caught the call as it was ringing. When I picked up, I heard a bunch of garbled alien-like noises. It was almost like the chirping and whirling of an old dial-up modem, only much more advanced and organic sounding. Unfortunately, it was too fuzzy and distorted to make anything else out. I've tried searching forums, chat rooms, and various other websites for a few years afterward, looking for any kind of rational explanation, but I found nothing. The call stopped around December of 2001, but the creepiest thing was that every time I missed the call, a strange sensation came over me, like I was being watched very closely. No one was ever in close proximity to me when I found out that I had missed a call. I remember trying to take photos of the screen as evidence, but it was somehow never visible in all the pictures I took in any light. Remember, 20 years ago we didn't have cameras built into phones, and screenshots weren't a thing either. So what do you think? Was it a random error, or was it my future self trying to warn me about something? Could it have been aliens, or was it some kind of temporal communication technology being tested on me? Or perhaps it was just another glitch in the Matrix. All I know is that it felt very wrong at the time, like I had accidentally stumbled upon something I shouldn't have.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
In June of last year, I graduated from high school. I never had an easy time making new friends, but during quarantine I got pretty close to a couple of old acquaintances of mine. Their names were Kevin and John. Physical description time. Kevin is a tall, fat kid with a ridiculously big head and short, unkempt, dark brown hair and a chin strap. John is even taller than Kevin, around 6'4", but very skinny, with light brown hair and bad acne. They're both the type that always gets into trouble, whether they're drinking, smoking, or busting into places. Even though I did some pretty sketchy shit sometimes, drinking and smoking wasn't really my thing. Despite that, they pressured me into hanging out with them, and for a time I sort of enjoyed their company. We got along pretty well because of our similar outlooks on the world. However, they could be real hypocrites sometimes. One time I made the mistake of letting them drive my car, and they drove out to a place in the woods where they peer pressured me into smoking. Looking back, I realize now that they were just using me for my car. Call it a bad decision, but I'm still not sure why I didn't cut ties with them right there. The second incident is where this all really started. About a month ago, despite everyone warning me not to hang out with them, I let them take me to a party. Since I was growing suspicious of them, I took my own car and followed them there. The first red flag was when they parked 2 streets away from where the party was taking place, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. We got to the address and were turned away immediately. Kevin tried to convince them to let us in, but it was useless. At that point, I knew something was up with Kevin and John. The next day, I decided that enough was enough and was tired of being around fake people. I needed to cut them off. Since John didn't have a phone, I texted his girlfriend and told her to tell Kevin and John that I was done. That night, I got a Snapchat from John. "Yo, my girlfriend dumped me because of you, you fucking asshole," he said in all caps, followed by 3 middle finger emojis. I then got a message from Kevin, which pretty much said the same thing. He called me the C word and warned me to stay away from him and John. I laughed to myself, thinking that they wouldn't do anything. They even admitted to me in the past that they weren't as tough as they acted, and here they were threatening me. I got a kick out of it, but I should not have let my guard down. That Friday, my mother, who has multiple sclerosis, spent the day in the hospital getting experimental medicine through an IV. My dad called me around 5 and said that she was going through some side effects, but that she would be okay. However, they would need to spend the night there, meaning that I would be home alone for the rest of that night. I did what I used to do every night before going to college. I stayed up for a while playing Madden with all the lights off, and after one of my games, I decided to check Snapchat. Something in my gut told me to look at my Snap map. For those of you who aren't familiar with Snapchat, it's a map that shows you your friends' locations. Anyway, I checked, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw that Kevin and John were just outside of my house. As I was trying to calm myself down, I got a call from my neighbor. When I picked up, he sounded frantic and told me that he had seen 2 people climb my fence and jump into my backyard. He said his wife had already called the police and that I needed to hide until they got there. I ran down the hall and into my room, locking my door and hiding in my closet. Shortly after, I heard the sound of glass breaking and footsteps in the common area of my house. Luckily for me, I live at the front of my neighborhood, just off the main road, and there's usually a police car stationed outside of our neighborhood, looking for speeders, so they got there within about 2 minutes. I heard my front door being forced open, followed by multiple police officers yelling at the intruders. Not long after that, I heard a knock on my bedroom door and a police officer announcing himself. He then entered my room and told me that it was safe. One of the windows in the kitchen was completely destroyed. Kevin and John were escorted out of my house in cuffs. My dad got back home soon after. He hugged me for at least a minute. He said that my mom didn't really understand what was happening because of how loopy the medicine made her, but the next day she came back home and broke down in tears over how close I was to dying. There's a lot of things about that incident that have been bothering me. The way I underestimated them, the evil looks they gave me as they were escorted out, and the one thing that will always stick with me is what I heard the police officers say when they entered my house. "Drop the gun!" It's a terrifying feeling knowing that I could have been murdered by people who I used to call my friends. The police told me that when they busted down the door, Kevin and John were waiting in the foyer. Kevin was brandishing a pistol. They believed that they were either waiting for me to come out of my room and attack me when I least expected it, or they were going to shoot me while I was laying on the couch playing video games. They told the police that it was meant to be a joke during the interrogation, and that John laughed about it, but it was obviously bullshit. To me, it just proved how sick and dangerous they were. I still haven't totally wrapped my head around the fact that things could have gone so much worse if my neighbors hadn't seen them climbing my fence that night, and it serves as a reminder to me to live life to the fullest. Kevin and John are currently awaiting trial for breaking and entering and attempted murder. They also got slapped with drug charges because of all the narcotics that was found in their car. I'll be forever grateful to my neighbors for saving my life. When I was 14, I was in a very dark place in my life. My parents would never let me go out, and because of that, I developed a rebellious streak. I'm a 5'5" Caucasian woman with long blonde hair. At the time, I was suffering from severe depression. I would be officially diagnosed by the doctor months after the events of this story. I used to sneak out of my house, go out to parties, and use drugs. Typical teenager type of stuff. I was lying about my age and hanging out with people over 18. I looked a lot older for my age. I now realize that my self-destructive behavior was ruining my life, and it led me down a dark path I almost never came back from. I'm from a quiet little town in Pennsylvania. We basically lived in the middle of nowhere. I would go out to parties in the nearby town of Scranton, which most people know as the town from The Office. It seems all happy and bubbly, but like with every town, it has a dark side to it. One night I went out to this party with a friend. We'll call her Jamie. I never really knew her that well. She seemed cool, and we went to the same school, but that was the extent of it. Jamie turned a lot of heads with her dark skin and long curly hair. She drove the guys crazy. 2 guys drove to my town to pick us up at night. It was a pretty far drive, but they thought we were cute, and we went along with it. When we got to this party, we realized that we were the only girls there, and there were about 10 to 15 other men there. The guys that we came there with told us to come upstairs to meet some friends of theirs, and we all sat down and smoked with them for a while. The guy hosting this party was named Devin, and he showed me around his apartment while Jamie stayed behind smoking with the other guys. After the tour, Devin asked me and Jamie to come into his room, so we did, thinking nothing of it. Big mistake. Devin closed the door and tried to get us to have sex with him. We said no and got up to leave the room, but when we tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, so we continued to pull on the door. After about 30 seconds, we realized there was someone on the other side of the door, holding it shut. I continued to pull on the door with everything I had, as Jamie looked through the crack when it opened to see that there were 3 other men outside the door. She saw that one of them had a gun in their belt, but didn't say anything because Devin was in the room with us, trying to stop us from breaking the door. We started banging on it and shouting. That's when we heard someone come up the stairs and say,
What the hell are you guys doing? Is someone yelling in there?
I began screaming, "Help us!" You could clearly hear how scared I was. We heard an argument break out on the other side of the door. I was still pulling on the door with all my might, and Jamie was still banging on it, hoping that someone would open it. As the door came open, we took our chance and ran for it. One of the men in the hallway grabbed my shirt. I screamed so loud that the whole neighborhood probably heard me. I honestly think he let go out of shock. Jamie was already down the stairs and out of the apartment. I followed closely behind, nearly tripping over my own feet. We ran down the block and hid behind a shed. Seconds later, we heard gunshots and someone yelling our names. I was trying to be as quiet as I could, but I couldn't hold back the tears. If we stayed, we would have been found. So we ended up running through someone's yard. I ended up falling, scraping up my knee pretty bad. After a while, I could no longer run because of how bad my leg was hurting, and blood was now coming out of my wound and down my leg, onto my shoes. I was speed walking with a limp, while Jamie was trying to help me keep pace so that they wouldn't catch up to us. We kept going through people's yards and trying to find a good place to hide. We turned a corner onto a street, and I heard a car come to a sudden halt nearby. Me and Jamie looked at each other with fear in our eyes, terrified that we had been discovered. The hairs on my arm stood up as I saw one of the guys get out of the back seat of the car and point a gun at us. We moved just in time as the gunshots missed us and hit a car on the side of the street. We ran away as fast as we could. The cops then turned the corner on the opposite side of the street and saw the men who were shooting at us. There was a firefight. We hid under someone's porch as gunshots broke out between the police and the men pursuing us. More cops came flying past the house, and we spent the next 5 minutes with our heads down, listening to the gunfire and shouting. Eventually, the men were overpowered and surrounded, and were forced to surrender. Once all the men were in handcuffs, we got up and walked down another street and called Jamie's brother to come get us. He took us back to his apartment and patched up my leg, as Jamie told him everything that went down. Afterward, he took both of us home. I stumbled into my house and changed as fast as I could. I'm not a very religious person, but that night I was praying to whatever gods were listening. I took off my blood-soaked clothes and hid them under my bed, crawled under the covers, and just stared up at my ceiling, thinking about the events that had just transpired. I didn't get much sleep that night, knowing that those guys knew where I lived. Actually, I couldn't sleep for days. I became a literal zombie, worried that they would come for me eventually. After my parents figured out something was wrong with me, they thought that I was being bullied at school or something, and had me go live with my aunt in another state for a while. I came back months later to find out that the men who picked us up that night were in jail, and would be there for a couple of years. I finally felt safe again. Those men had bad intentions, and I often think about what would have happened to us if we hadn't run out of there when we did. This story happened to me in September of last year, and is by far the scariest thing that I've ever experienced. I live on the second floor of a residential house in a pretty large suburb with my fiance and our cat. The night that this happened, I decided to get some cool air by opening up all the windows, since our landlord had just removed all the AC units during a renovation. Being on the second floor, I didn't really give a second thought to having all the windows open. I mean, you'd have to be some kind of freak to climb up and enter someone's apartment in the dead of night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to my cat growling, and I got up to see what his deal was. I needed a drink of water anyway. When I walked into the hallway, I saw a figure standing at the entrance of my kitchen, being half asleep. I said, "Renee, what are you doing up? Are you okay?" I thought it was my fiance, but once I realized it couldn't have been her, I went from half asleep to being fully awake as pure terror ran through my body. I ran back into my room, yelling like a lunatic. Renee woke up screaming. I told her to call 911 as I jumped over the bed and pulled out my loaded 9mm I keep in my dresser drawer. The figure appeared in my doorway, and I pointed the gun right at them. The intruder quickly ducked out of the way and ran back down the hallway. I gave chase, yelling and aiming my gun. They ran into the living room and jumped out of the window, plummeting 2 stories onto the pavement below, letting out a loud scream as they collided with the ground. They tried to get up and run, but kept falling back down. I found out later that they had broken one of their legs. About 30 seconds later, a police car came speeding up in front of the house. The officer got out and handcuffed the man. More officers showed up shortly after and took my statement. It turned out that this man was under the influence of hardcore drugs and had been arrested for burglary in the past. When they searched him, they found a knife. I assume that he was just looking to steal from us, but you never truly know what someone's intentions are. If it wasn't for my cat and my gun, I might not be here to write this. I'm just glad that no one was hurt, and that the man was arrested. I do sincerely hope he gets the help he needs, and more importantly, he stays far away from my house. If you're wondering how he even got in, the police told me that he used a ladder my landlord had left out from the previous week. Now, every night before bed, I always make sure every window is closed and locked. I'll start off by saying that this isn't my story. It's a messed up experience from when my older cousin, Dylan, was just a kid. He told me about this recently, and I'll be writing it from his point of view moving forward. I think everyone has memories from their childhood that bother us. I'm 24 years old now, but this is something that I'll never forget. When I was in elementary school, I did what was called the Extended Day Program. It was essentially a daycare after school for kids whose parents worked late. This happened to me when I was in 2nd grade, and I was 7 years old at the time. My parents worked late on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. My older sister, Alyssa, had a part-time job at McDonald's. Usually my parents would come pick me up, but on Tuesdays and Thursdays, my sister would pick me up at around 4:30, which was an hour and a half after school ended. It was a chilly day in March. We were on the playground, just messing around. It was about 4:10, when the teacher who was watching us on the playground, Mr. McCann, told me that I was going home. He walked me back into the school, where I grabbed my stuff and walked out to the lobby. There, I met a young woman who was no older than 30. She was skinny, about 5'2", and had long dark hair with tan skin, a pointy nose, and a lot of makeup on, topped off with a nose ring and a tattoo on her left arm. She knelt down and asked me if I was Dylan. And me being a dumb kid, I said yes. She introduced herself as Heather. She told me that she worked with my sister, and she was here to pick me up, since apparently my sister had to work extra late that night. A side note, she never actually mentioned my sister by name. This will be important later on. Anyway, she took my hand, and we walked out to her car together. And obviously, I didn't think anything of it. No alarm bells were going off in my head yet, because again, I was just a dumb kid. When we got to her car, Heather offered me M&Ms. I thought she was being nice, so I ate them. And I know what most of you are probably thinking, but luckily they turned out to be normal M&Ms. At first, nothing seemed off. Heather took me down the same ways that my parents and my sister would always take me to and from school. It wasn't until she passed my street by that I started to realize that something was off. I told her that we passed by my street, but she just responded by saying, "Okay," and kept going down the main road. She no longer had that caring, friendly tone that she had when I met her less than 30 minutes before. She seemed cold, not really caring about how nervous I was. I asked her if she could get me a Happy Meal, and she responded by yelling at me, "Shut up, kid!" After a couple of minutes of silence, I then asked another question, and her answer terrified me. "So are you and Alyssa friends?" Who's Alyssa? My heart and lungs dropped to the pit of my stomach. Even as a kid, I knew that this meant I was in serious danger. I started crying, afraid of what was going to happen next. Heather kept screaming for me to shut up, and even reached over and slapped me a couple of times. Eventually, she got so fed up with me, she pulled over, put the car in park, and pulled a roll of duct tape from the center console. Then, just like in an action movie, a police car pulled up behind us just in time. Heather dropped the duct tape, put the car in drive, then floored it down the road. The speed limit was 30, but she had to be going at least 60, maybe even 70. This lasted for about 5 minutes. I kept crying as Heather floored it down the road, taking turns at ridiculous speeds. We soon came upon 2 police cars blocking the road. Heather slammed on the brakes, sliding to a stop just before she hit one of the police cars. She got out and started running, but luckily the cops were able to stop her before she took off into the forest alongside the road. As Heather was taken into custody, one of the police officers took me home in his car. When I got home, Alyssa was sobbing, and as soon as she saw me, she hugged me for about 2 minutes straight. My parents arrived home shortly after. They had heard about what happened and were both pretty upset. That night, they had a very long talk with me about stranger danger. The police came back later and checked in on us, and asked me a few more questions. It turns out that Heather was not the woman's real name, and she had no connection to my sister whatsoever. And even though I had no idea at the time, the woman's ex-boyfriend was on trial for child pornography and sex trafficking. What still confuses me about this is how Heather knew who I was. Keep in mind that I was only 7, and this happened before social media really took off. I do have a theory though. Mr. McCann, the teacher that ran the after-school program, was fired after this incident. I saw in the news many years later that he had been charged with molesting a student at another school. He ended up taking his own life before he stood trial. I think there's a chance that both he and Heather are connected, but I have no proof of that, and I'll never know for sure. To all the kids out there listening, please be careful with strangers, and always listen to your parents when they warn you about the dangers of the world. To all the parents, for the love of God, teach your kids about stranger danger. Hopefully Heather is either in jail or got some kind of help, and she'll never try to harm another kid ever again. This happened a while ago. I have since been diagnosed with PTSD because of this incident. I'm currently on medication to suppress the recurring nightmares. For some background, at the time I was only 9 years old. I am a female from Georgia. My mother met my stepfather at a church we recently started attending with her best friend. When this happened, they were just dating. It was a fairly normal church for the most part. It was a somewhat run-down building, with an outdated interior and an old basement. The pastor was an ex-drug addict turned man of God, who was honestly one of the nicest people I've ever met. It was a cold winter night. Saturday church service had just ended. We left the church and headed towards my mom's old Pontiac Vibe. It was the kind of car that didn't have electric locks or windows. Each door had to be locked and unlocked on its own. We sat in the parking lot talking for some time. Since my stepfather lived in a different city back then, he and my mom wanted to maximize their time together. They were discussing upcoming holiday plans when I noticed a figure wearing a green coat moving between the cars parked nearby. I didn't think anything of it at the time, as it could have been our pastor or another churchgoer. My stepdad got into the passenger seat, and we were about to take off, when his door was suddenly pulled open. There was a man in a green hoodie that none of us recognized. He had dark skin, bloodshot eyes, and a shaved head. He looked completely deranged. He shoved a gun into my stepdad's abdomen. "Give me your wallet!" he demanded. Mind you, my stepfather is a Hispanic man. He speaks English well now, but he wasn't fluent back then, and he had a thick accent, so he simply responded to the man, "No." My mom began freaking out. I was so scared that I kept trying to get out of the car. I started crying because my mom told me to stay put. Then the man began screaming, "I said give me your wallet!" But my stepdad stood firm. "No." The man then directed his attention at my mother. "Tell him I said to give me his wallet." Thinking that he couldn't understand him, my mother tried to get my stepdad to comply, but he refused. I'm looking frantically through our fogged up windows, trying to find someone to get their attention. But the man looked at me, then back to my mom. He then hit my stepdad with his gun, causing him to lean forward. He then pointed the gun at me, a 9-year-old girl in a pink and black dress who was talking about Christmas dinner just 5 minutes before. "Somebody better give me something, or she dies." I lost it. I got out of my seat and exited the car. That's when I saw 2 other hooded men across the parking lot. They were walking towards the car, also carrying guns. I started screaming and immediately got back in the car. My mom yelled at me for getting out, and the man with the gun was still screaming at my stepdad. "Are you listening to me, man? I'm going to shoot her right between the fucking eyes!" My mom then offered him all the cash she had on her. She handed him $75 from her wallet. The man ripped away the cash from her, then assaulted my stepdad again with his gun. The mugger then slammed his arm against the car door to close it, but in the process the gun went off. The bullet went into the well of my mom's car. The 3 men ran off into the night. We sat there crying and trying to console each other. After about 30 minutes, we calmed ourselves down and left. We immediately went to the police station and filed a report. They said it was most likely gang activity, and it would be very difficult to track down the perpetrators. The men could have killed my stepfather right in front of my mother. There was no justice. I was only a child when this happened. It's been 13 years, and I still wake up screaming and sweating from the nightmares. I'm just glad that my mom had her grocery money on her that day. Heaven knows what would have happened if she didn't. At the time of this story, My close friend and I were in our late 20s. We became roommates and moved into a new apartment in the Greater Toronto area. It was a great neighborhood, with low crime rates and lots of tourists. Not a bad place at all. The building was in great shape, but very old, and many of the tenants have told us that they've been there for over 20 years. We were assured that the locks were changed before we moved in. There was a maintenance guy who took care of the building, who was in his late 60s. I was the last to leave the apartment. It was around 8 a.m., and I locked the door behind me. My roommate got home that day at 4:30 p.m., changed, and then left again to go run errands. We both arrived back at the apartment around 6 p.m. The first thing I did was go to my room and change out of my work clothes and put on some yoga pants. I then noticed that my closet looked a bit messy. It caught my attention because I'm very much a type A personality. My belongings looked out of place. Some items were laying on the closet floor, while others looked like they had been placed into incorrect storage containers. Furthermore, it looked like somebody had gone through my dirty laundry and tossed the clothes out of their way, which is probably what caused the box full of stuff to fall in the first place. Because I'm a very tidy person, I knew right away that this was not right. The thought crossed my mind that my roommate might be responsible, but I've known her for a long time. There was no way that she would do this. If she ever needed anything from me, she would ask. Fast forward to 9:45. I'm in my room, and all of a sudden, I hear my roommate call my name loudly. So I got up to see what was wrong. "I found the gift you left me." What? "The present you left in my pillow." I just stared at her. I had no idea what she was talking about. Then I saw something on her bed. It was a dildo. My dildo. I grabbed it and said, "Hey, that's mine." "Well, what the fuck is it doing in my bed? I found it in my pillow. You didn't put it there?" Fuck no. It was supposed to be stored in my closet." Now the wheels started turning, and things were coming together. Someone must have entered our apartment, went into my room, looked through my dirty laundry, and found the sex toy in one of the storage boxes, then put it inside my roommate's pillowcase, so she would find it when she went to bed. After being in shock for a few minutes, the reality sunk in. There were no signs of forced entry. The intruder likely entered with a key. We decided to talk to the building managers. They were an old couple who lived in the same building. They seemed concerned and clearly saw that I was an emotional wreck. But the husband tried to play it down, saying that it was probably just a joke, and then asked us if we gave anyone a copy of the apartment key. Stupid question. Since the husband was a frail old man with cancer, I truly believed that he had no involvement. We decided to call the cops, and they came within an hour or so. I told them the whole story, and they took all of our info. But honestly, there wasn't much that they could do, and I figured as much, but at least we had a paper trail. I definitely mentioned the maintenance man as someone that they should question. I'm convinced that the intruder either had to be a staff member or someone who had access to the apartment keys. As of the writing of this story, there has been literally no word from the cops. The good news is I don't believe that anyone has been in our apartment since that day. This story took place in the summer of 2017. My friend and I were young teenage girls at the time. We didn't live in the best of areas. One night we decided to go for a walk around the local pond, which wasn't far from my house. It was pitch black out that night, although there was some sporadic lighting from the streetlights, which were all spaced far apart. However, there was still enough light to guide us to the pond. We left my house and began walking up the dark street. We stopped at one end of the pond and sat down on a bench. This bench happened to be right under the single light that overlooked the pond. And since the light was directly above us, anyone approaching would see us perfectly illuminated. Looking back, it wasn't a good idea to sit there at night. It practically made us a target. We talked for a while, but after a few minutes, I noticed some movement in the distance. I squinted my eyes and saw a group of silhouettes approaching us. Since I'm a paranoid person on a good day, I alerted my friend to the presence of what I assumed was a group of people swiftly coming our way. We debated for a moment on what we should do. The first option was to keep sitting on the bench and assume that they were just harmless individuals who wouldn't do anything to us. The other option was to take no chances and make a run for it back to my house. Something about these approaching figures was threatening to me. So we quickly got back on our feet and started off with a speed walk. I looked back, and my worst fears were confirmed. The group of figures was now sprinting right for us. That's when my fear truly kicked in. My friend and I began to run full speed. I kept looking back at the group as we ran, and noticed that they were gaining on us. I could not make out any features of the people due to the lack of lighting, so we were just blindly running from several faceless figures, which added to the terror. We eventually arrived at my house and hid in my front yard for a while. Since we were being followed, I didn't want them knowing where I lived. Eventually we went inside, making sure to lock the doors behind us. When we were talking about it after the fact, she said that she never looked back like I did, so we don't actually know if they attempted to follow us the whole way back. For all we know, it could have been a group of kids just playing a prank on us. But under the circumstances, and the area's reputation, we were glad that we didn't take any chances. This story is from the perspective of a female. I have worked as the night shift telephone operator at a casino hotel for 14 years. I'm used to dealing with drunks, assholes, and perverts on a daily basis. I get a lot of unwanted attention because of my voice. I've been serenaded and even proposed to. I'm usually able to shrug it off, but on the night in question, I received a phone call from someone who was an extremely deranged individual. It started off like any other normal Saturday night. A drunken guest called from his hotel room.
Hey, can I get 2 sets of towels up here, please?
My pleasure, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you?
Yeah. You.
I sighed in annoyance. We'll get those items up to you shortly, sir. Have a wonderful evening. I hung up, thinking that I had heard the last from that guest. But I was wrong. About 15 minutes later, he called back.
Hey, everything's here. Except you.
I don't work in housekeeping, sir.
Damn. Your voice, though. I bet you're hot, aren't you? Why don't you come up and see me?
Sir, I'm not allowed to leave my desk. Do you need anything else?
Do you not understand what I'm telling you? I need you.
I hung up on him again and continued to take calls. That night, I was the only operator on duty, which was usually the case. After a while, I had almost forgotten about the guy, when he called again about 30 minutes later.
Hey, I've got champagne and cheesecake up here for you.
Not for me, sir. You enjoy it, and have a good night.
Wait, don't hang up. You're the love of my life. I've never loved anyone but you.
I was losing my patience with this drunken idiot. Sir, I don't have time for this. Enjoy your cheesecake and have a good night, I said firmly before hanging up. I knew that I lost my temper, but I couldn't help it. This was getting ridiculous. A few minutes later, he calls back.
If you won't come to me, I guess I'll just have to come to you. I want you. I need you.
Sir, you need to stop calling me, or I'm going to inform security. I'm trying to work here. I slammed the phone down again, slightly rattled. This has never happened to me on this level before, and it was starting to scare me. He calls back.
What do I have to do to get you up here? You know that I know your boss. All I have to do is tell him that I want you, and you'll be mine. I practically own this fucking place. One phone call, and you're gonna be up here, on your knees!
I hung up the phone in disgust. Then I quickly dialed security and explained to them what was going on. All the security guys are buddies of mine. They said that they would be up there to talk to him immediately and to let them know if he called back again. A short time later, he did.
They're trying to keep you from me. They don't know how much I love you. how I need you. I'm coming for you.
I called security again. They told him that if he called back one more time, they would have the sheriff's office come out. So a short time later, I received another phone call from the lobby phone. At first, all I could hear was heavy breathing. And then, that familiar voice.
I'll fucking find you. I need you. You belong to me. Where the fuck are you?
I hung up and called security, who immediately sent an officer to the lobby. They also said that they were going to call the sheriff right away. Since I don't work at the front desk, I'm nowhere near the lobby. I'm in a safe, undisclosed location, behind a secured door, where he couldn't possibly find me. But still, the caller's behavior frightened me. My coworker then called me from the front desk.
Hey, there's this creepy guy up here asking about you. I didn't tell him anything. Do you need me to call security?
Oh my god, are you kidding me? I've already called them. They should be on their way. Where is he now?
He's standing right... Oh shit. Where'd he go? Fuck. I'm calling security. Lock the office door, okay?
After that, I quickly contacted my buddy in surveillance. They said that they were aware of the guy and were tracking him. He was pacing by the employee's door, looking for another way to get downstairs, to where I was.
Don't worry, security just caught up with him, and the sheriff just pulled up.
I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't realize until just then how bad I was shaking. This man was a lunatic, wandering the halls of the hotel, looking for me. He doesn't even know me, for Christ's sakes, and has no idea what I look like, and yet he was determined to find me. I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. I have no idea how much time passed before the head of security, who was a good friend of mine, came into the office. The sound of the door opening made me jump. Hey, it's going to be okay. Just breathe. He's banned from here, and the sheriff deputies have escorted him off the property. You should go home. You want me to call the manager? No, I'll be okay. Really, thank you. I just wasn't prepared for that level of crazy tonight is all. Are you sure you're going to be okay? I was far from okay. But I knew there wasn't anyone to cover my shift, and I was no longer in danger. For the rest of that night, several of my buddies in security came by to check on me. I don't know what that man said to them, and I don't think I want to know. But I'll tell you this. I've never seen a group of big tough guys look so worried and disturbed before. I guess that's what happens when you come face to face with someone who has truly lost their mind. The year was 2015. I was around 14 or 15 back then and was a freshman in high school. I was always a quiet kid. Everyone knew me as the one artsy girl who gave everyone the side eye. I didn't like anyone in my grade or my school for the most part. I usually had no friends and was always a loner. However, in 6th grade, a few years before 2015, I made a best friend. Her name was Ray. Ray and I were almost the same person with a few minor differences. We shared the same interests, did the same things. Hell, we even played the same kind of guitar. And we both hated everybody. It was like we were long-lost sisters. We did a lot of things together, and I will admit that we did some weird stuff as freshmen. We used to smoke and wander around the streets at night, which sparked the idea that we should sneak out into the forest behind the elementary school and smoke there. We lived in upstate New York, where small towns and gossipy people were the only things around. So smoking in the forest would be the safest spot, since we didn't want our neighbors to snitch on us. Fast forward to March, Ray and I had planned out what we were going to do. We decided to meet at a church that was 5 houses down from Ray's house. Around midnight, I headed out. I packed a bag with cigarettes and a small lighter, along with a few snacks. Sneaking out of my house would be a challenge. My sister would go nuts if she found out that I left. I managed to jump out from the 2nd floor window Thankfully, I landed on some small bushes below. I picked myself up and began to jog down the road to Ray's house. We didn't live too far from each other, but the distance was considerable. We met at the church. There was a path behind the chapel that led up a hill and towards the elementary school. As we walked, we were being obnoxiously loud, especially Ray. I assumed that she had drank something beforehand to make the night more fun for her, but I was getting nervous, so I began to shush her just in case anyone was around. Eventually, we ended up at the elementary school. We made our way past the playground and soon entered the dark forest beyond. The tall grass was covered in melting snow, which made the ground damp and muddy. Our footsteps were loud, but we didn't care. Who else would be out in the woods at this hour? I forgot to mention that I also brought my ukulele with me, so we found a spot by a large tree, and I began to play an old tune while Ray danced around like an idiot with a cigarette dangling from her mouth. We laughed for a while before we ended up talking about life and whatnot. It was around then that I realized it was pitch black, and I couldn't even see the moonlight. "Hey, we've been out here for a while. We should start heading back. It got really dark out here all of a sudden," I said to Ray. She chuckled, saying that I was just trying to kill the mood. But regardless, I had the feeling that we were not alone out here. I looked around as she continued rambling. I then heard heavy breathing coming from somewhere close by. Thinking that I was just being paranoid, I brushed it off and continued our conversation. But not even 2 minutes later, I heard actual footsteps behind us. I didn't dismiss them this time. They were loud, heavy footsteps, crunching leaves beneath them as they moved closer to us. I grabbed my belongings and tugged on Ray's arm, yanking her ass off the ground, and began screaming at her to run. I pushed her ahead of me, ensuring she got a head start, since she wasn't the fastest runner. My heart was pounding so hard that I couldn't even hear her screaming. She quickly glanced behind her and suddenly screamed that someone was behind us, about to grab me. So I darted off in a different direction. But the footsteps continued to pursue me. I ran as fast as I could, shouting at Ray to get back to the path that led out of the forest. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. Then a loud and deranged bellow resonated through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. I quickened my pace and jumped over a small perimeter fence. I landed harshly on the gravel on the other side, but I wasted no time getting back to my feet, running up the hill where I saw Ray emerging from the forest. I reached my friend with tears in my eyes. Ray was terrified, covering her mouth with her hand and hyperventilating. "We need to get the fuck out of here," I told her. We took a different path back to my house. She was too scared to walk back home alone. Alone. In the dark. The next morning, my sister asked me what she was doing at our house, and why there were dirty clothes scattered across the floor that smelled like cigarettes. We lied about the whole thing, but she knew something was up. Thankfully, she never snitched on us. To this day, I still have no idea who was in the woods with us that night, and why the hell they screamed like a deranged lunatic. But to any younger kids out there who feel like they need to sneak out at night, just don't. You don't want to end up telling a story like this, or never telling one at all. So a little backstory. I grew up in a close-knit community surrounded by houses and parks. As far as crime goes, very little ever occurred there. Things came full circle last year, when I moved into a house in my old neighborhood. It was just off of the main road that connected to a local mental hospital. There had always been an underlying concern from the residents about that place, but there had never been an incident where a patient escaped. Over time, we got used to it. However, things changed over the years. It was no longer the quiet, peaceful place I remembered. The amount of noise and crime I witnessed after moving in was astonishing. My wife travels a lot for work, and when she does, I tend to sleep in my game room towards the back of the house. One night, I had a horrific nightmare. I was lying on a bed in a dark room at the hospital when I got that feeling you get when you know that you're being watched. I scanned the room to find my wife standing in the corner, looking directly in my eyes. "Josh, wake up. Someone is about to break in. You need to wake up." I sprung up and immediately grabbed the handgun I kept in my nightstand. I opened my back door to find someone standing in my backyard with a crowbar. The figure took a few steps towards me with the crowbar raised above their head, and I raised my firearm. "Come any closer, and I'll shoot." The figure then stopped dead in their tracks, then took off, jumping over the brick fence that separates our backyard from the main road. I called the non-emergency number and let the dispatcher know what just happened. It turns out that the man in my backyard was an escapee from the mental hospital. It was the first time that anyone had ever escaped from that place, and he ended up in my backyard with a crowbar. Lucky me.
There's always a reason to be afraid. Sorry, but the content that you're watching is prohibited. We have been tracking your IP address and have found your watch history to be problematic. But don't worry, Big Brother is here for you, and we're going to help you. So relax and enjoy our approved programming.
Hey, I'm K-Station, and this is the 259 Challenge.
Yeah!
Tonight, we're gonna be trying to fight some ghosts, or even possibly...
We're gonna do this!
We're gonna fucking kill some ghosts.
We're gonna fucking do
be
this!
sure to hit subscribe for a chance to win a free ghost!
Hell yeah! We're gonna get 3 ghosts!
Do you want to avoid this? NordVPN creates an encrypted tunnel for your data and protects your online identity by concealing your IP address so that you can avoid things like government censorship, IP scrapers, and data harvesting. While you browse the web safely and securely, you can sync up to 6 devices so that you have around-the-clock protection no matter where you are. NordVPN is offering the viewers of my channel an exclusive deal, so use my link in the description, nordvpn.com/unit522, and try out NordVPN for yourself. It's risk-free, and there's a money-back guarantee. It's time to go stealth mode with NordVPN. This story takes place during the height of the pandemic in 2020. I had always been a little overweight and lazy, and since there was no one out on the roads, I decided to take up walking. My neighborhood wraps around itself. By the time you made it all the way around, you would have walked an entire mile. The only people I ever saw were this nice couple that walked around the same time that I did. We would always stop and have these nice little chats from time to time. I would even look forward to my walks just to talk to these people. But one day, they vanished. I would never see them out and about. The grass outside of their home became overgrown, and it seemed like parts of their house were damaged from neglect. After a while, curiosity got the best of me, and I would knock on the door whenever I would pass by their house, but I would never get an answer. Now, on the day in question, I had been busy and missed my daily walk, so I decided to take my walk during the night. I grabbed a flashlight and went on my way. I eventually passed by the house. I then noticed that the front door was open. Being the curious person I was, I walked down the driveway and yelled into the house. Hello? Is there anyone here?" All was quiet. But as I stood there, I heard a creak to my right. I peeked inside with my flashlight, and then my light fell upon a tall, rough-looking man just standing there, grinning at me. I was startled when I saw him. He then lunged towards me and began to chase me. As I mentioned earlier, I was overweight, so I couldn't run very fast. He would have caught up to me if it wasn't for a car passing by. The man ran back inside, and I managed to get away and call the police. When they arrived, they found the man in the same spot he was when I first saw him. It wouldn't be till a while later before all the details came out. The man who chased me that night confessed to brutally murdering the couple who lived at the house and burying their bodies in the backyard. He also admitted to torturing them before ending their lives. The night that I walked into the house, he was in the middle of making sure the bodies were not uncovered by the heavy rain. The house was bulldozed after they dug up the bodies and were given a proper burial. The scumbag tried to plead insanity, but the court ruled that out, giving him 2 life sentences without parole. I sometimes still walk past where the couple once lived, and every time I do, I think about how those 2 sweet, innocent people were taken out of this world by an absolute monster. About a month ago, my friends and I got some tickets to a professional hockey game in Minneapolis. The game was about a 5-hour drive from where we lived, so we decided to make a weekend trip out of it. On that Friday afternoon, I was picked up by my friend Kevin. We then drove to pick up my other friend Dan and hit the road. We weren't heading for a motel, but instead to the house of our mutual friend, Jack. Jack lived in North Minneapolis, and he offered to let us stay at his house for the weekend. We had all grown up together and were really good friends with him, and he also had a ticket to the hockey game as well, so things were lining up. We arrived at Jack's house early in the morning, and Kevin parked the car out front. He then texted Jack to let him know that we were there. We all got out and walked over to the trunk to grab our bags. It was about this time that we heard tires screeching. We then turned to look at the intersection directly behind us. A green compact car had apparently cut off a dark-colored SUV as the driver was proceeding through the intersection. Both vehicles came to a stop, and the 2 male drivers had rolled down their windows and began yelling at each other. Not wanting to get involved, I quickly grabbed my bag and walked up the path towards Jack's house, with Dan close behind me. Jack lived in a sort of retrofitted duplex, where he rented out the ground floor and someone else lived on the second. Jack had moved to the city fairly recently, and we had never visited him until now, so when we entered the walk-in porch, Dan and I weren't sure which door was his. As we stood there, I pulled out my phone to call Jack and asked him to let us in. Meanwhile, Kevin was still in the back of his car rearranging some bags and trying to fix a panel that had popped off during the drive. The 2 drivers were still yelling at each other, and at this point, they had both exited their vehicles. I didn't have a great view of the situation from the porch, but I could still hear them yelling at each other. To make matters worse, Jack's house was right on the corner, so we were only about 20 yards away from where this was going down. It was way too close for comfort. All of a sudden, we heard a loud pop. Dan and I froze, and I saw Kevin stand up from the back of his car and look around. I immediately thought it might have been a gunshot, but I wasn't 100% sure. I turned to Dan, and from the look on his face, I saw that he also thought it was a gunshot. Oh shit, okay, let's get the hell inside, now, Dan said to me nervously. I unfroze and quickly called Jack, who said that he was on his way to open the door. The 2 cars peeled off, and Kevin joined us on the porch. We all came to the conclusion that a gunshot went off, and that one of the 2 drivers had fired it during their confrontation. We didn't know who fired the shot or which direction the bullet went. However, Kevin said that he didn't hear any bullets whizzing past him. Jack led us into the house, commenting that he heard a shot go off too, and swearing that nothing like that had ever happened since he moved in. We talked about it for a bit, but no one was hurt, and the drivers were gone now, so we shook it off. Aside from that, we had a great weekend of eating, exploring, and getting drunk at a nail-biter of a hockey game. It was loads of fun, and Jack offered to drive us everywhere since he knew the area. When we were ready to head home that Sunday afternoon, we piled back into Kevin's car, That's when we realized exactly where the bullet had gone. There was a clean bullet hole through Kevin's rearview mirror and windshield. I have no idea how he had missed it before, but there were shards of glass and scattered bits of plastic across his dashboard. We looked around for an entrance hole in the back of the car, but we couldn't find one. That left only one possibility. The bullet came through the open hatch of Kevin's car while he was hunched down in the back trying to fix the panel. Kevin was no more than a foot away from being hit, based on the bullet's trajectory. Kevin would have been shot in the head or the neck if he had been standing straight up. Once the shock of our discovery wore off, we called the police to get a report for insurance purposes. An officer showed up, and Kevin showed her the bullet hole. At first, she was confused. I think for a second she even suspected that we were messing around and fired a gun inside the car. But when Kevin told her all the details, I saw the officer's jaw drop. Unfortunately, none of us could provide the officer with any truly useful information, like a detailed description of the shooter or a license plate number. Our next issue was finding out how the heck we were going to drive 5 hours with a bullet hole through the windshield. Thankfully, a patch-up job of sealer and duct tape from a local hardware store did the trick. On the drive home, we had a solemn conversation where we spent a few hours of hard thinking about the fragility of human life. Even now, I'm not sure if I've fully processed how close Kevin came to dying. I can't even imagine how he feels about it. As for the guy who thought it was a good idea to fire a gun in the middle of a highly populated neighborhood, I either hope he gets his life in order or ends up in jail. I work nights. I finish my shift around 4:45 a.m. I live in one of the 5 boroughs of New York. My neighborhood is relatively safe, and I've never had any issues until this incident. I was on a service road about a block away from my house. I pulled over to the left side of the street to fix something that had fallen while I was driving. I should have done this when I got home. When I looked into my rearview mirror, I saw a car that was uncomfortably close behind me. It hadn't been there when I first pulled over. I quickly put my car in drive and made a right, and the car followed. So I turned onto my street. I figured that I wouldn't go home right away in case I was being followed. I proceeded down another block at a slow pace, watching my rearview mirror the entire time. The car is still behind me. I made a right at the next stop sign, still driving slowly, and the car behind me does the same. I then made a sudden right turn down another block, increasing my speed. I look into my mirror again to see a pair of headlights. The chase was on. I made so many lefts and rights to get away from this pursuing vehicle, but the driver was stuck to me like glue. I then hit the SOS button on my SUV, which connects me to 911. I proceeded to tell the operator that I was being chased, and that I was running through traffic lights so that the police would figure out my location. The operator confirmed that they were tracking my vehicle, and they knew exactly where I was. At this point, I was going about 80 on a 35. I turn into the left lane, and the tailgater ends up right next to me in the opposite lane. I then made a daring move. I slammed on my brakes so the car could get ahead of me. I then get behind them. I could only imagine this enraged the tailgater, because a second later, they slammed on their brakes, and I almost rear-ended them, but thanks to my lightning-fast reflexes, I managed to avoid that, and my car came to a sudden stop. I screamed into the phone, reading out the license plate number, and then decided to drive to the police station, which was a few blocks down from us. I did not stop at any of the traffic lights as I flew down the road. The car continued to follow me all the way to the precinct. During all of this, I was still talking to the operator, who was relaying the information to the police. I was blaring on my horn as I pulled up, and the cops came running outside to me. The tailgater then made a U-turn and vanished into the night. After giving my statement to the police, they had a squad car follow me back home. They also patrolled the area for the rest of the night. I'm pretty sure the police know who it is, but unfortunately they haven't tracked him down yet. My name is Austin. I'm a 26-year-old male. and this story took place about a month ago. This occurred on a trip my fiancé and I were on. We had just moved down to Florida for a chance at better opportunities for myself from where I was living previously. However, my fiancé had to sacrifice a lot for this transition. So to help ease the stress, we decided to go on a weekend trip to Universal Orlando Resort and just have fun together. Now, we planned out everything ahead of time, and with the tickets being so much money, we opted to go for a cheaper hotel to bring the price down a bit, which was a huge mistake. We arrived at the hotel the day before we were supposed to visit the resort, and we immediately could see why it was so cheap. The sign said Quality Inn, but from the looks of it, it was previously a run-down hotel that the company had bought and slapped their name on it. The room was nothing special, and as soon as I sat on the bed, the frame broke. First clue as to just how bad this place was. We didn't spend too much time in the room as we planned to go to a movie that night, so we quickly dropped off our bags and left. By the time we got back, it was around 11 p.m. I was really tired, and I had a migraine. I quickly changed for bed and laid down, hoping I could just fall asleep, even though my head was throbbing. My fiancé did the same shortly after, and before long, we both drifted off. Before I continue, I'll explain the layout of the room briefly. As soon as you walk in, to the right are 2 beds, with a night table in between them, and to the left was a table and dresser where the TV sat. If you kept going straight, you would walk to the sink and bathroom area. It was a typical hotel room layout. My fiancé always needs to face the door when she sleeps, as it makes her feel more at ease. She was pressed against my chest, so it woke me the moment I felt her suddenly jolt up. She immediately tapped my shoulder before she whispered to me, "I hear someone at the door. I think they're trying to open it." I didn't hear anything, but the sound of her voice made me believe she wasn't making it up. We sat there listening for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds, before I heard something. It was the sound of someone trying to open the door with a key card. Before I even had a chance to speak, the door suddenly opened. However, my fiancé was smart and had put the door latch on before we went to bed. Through the crack in the door, I could see an eye looking right at us. I immediately jumped up from the bed and yelled, "Wrong room, buddy." The man then mumbled something unintelligible. Whoever it was, they seemed to be severely intoxicated, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But what he did next didn't need words to explain it. He then tried to push the door open with his hands. I yelled at him again, but this time with more force, trying to scare him away. I'm not the most imposing guy. I am pretty well built for my height and size. So I thought, if anything, I could at least sound intimidating enough to scare him away. I was wrong. After I shouted at the man, he stopped pushing on the door for a brief moment before slamming his shoulder into it, trying to break it down. My fiancé let out a scream and yelled for me to stop the man from coming in. From what I could see through the door's crack, he was a hefty guy. He had to be at least 6'1", over 250 pounds. So there was no way I was going to be able to stop him by strength alone. I grabbed the car keys off the table and held them in my hand, with the keys between my fingers. I decided that if this man came into our room, I was going to swing until I couldn't anymore. I ran to the door and flung my body against it, throwing the man back just enough for the door to shut again. He immediately ran back to the door and threw his way into it, while screaming words that I couldn't understand. Next to the door was a window, where I finally caught a glimpse of the man, and it confirmed my predictions of his size compared to mine. I also saw a woman, who I could only assume was his wife, along with 2 kids by her side. I couldn't believe this guy was acting this way in front of his family. I was snapped back to reality by my fiancée screaming that she was going to call the cops. And suddenly, the man stopped, and I could see him ushering the woman and kids away into an SUV. Moments later, they were gone. I don't know where they went, but I told my fiancé to call the front desk anyways to let them know what happened. Nobody answered, so I decided to go to the desk myself and speak to whoever was working the shift that night. "Lock the door. I'll be back." Once I walked into the lobby, a line was already forming, so I had to wait. After about 20 minutes, I was the second in line. When a lady approached the counter and spoke, my eyes darted to her when she started to speak, as the words she said not only sent a chill down my spine, but made every sense in my body become fully aware of my surroundings. "We just used this key card to get into the room, but there was already people in it." It was the wife of the man who had almost busted down my door. I immediately started to look around, and once I looked behind me and out the doors that opened into the lobby, I could see the same man standing there beside the SUV. I did not move, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I slowly turned my head back towards the desk and kept it that way. Eventually, the lady left with a new key card. It was then that I approached the desk. I explained what happened, and the lady behind the desk told me that it was her fault, as she had given those people the wrong key card by mistake. I was so angry that this woman just seemed to act as if what just happened to my fiancé and I wasn't anything to be concerned about. I told her to write down a note that I would be back in the morning to speak to the manager about leaving early and getting a refund, before storming back out into my room, more pissed off than I cared to admit. My fiancé didn't want to stay there for the night, but it was already so late that we relented. Once morning hit, we packed our bags and made our way to the front desk, fully expecting the manager to be filled in on what happened. But once we got there, we found out that this was not the case. The manager knew nothing about what happened, and even said that he asked the woman working the night shift if anything happened that they should have been aware of, and she told him no. I was again more pissed off than I cared to admit, but the manager quickly gave us a refund and checked us out early while apologizing profusely. At that point, I just wanted to get my fiancé and myself the hell out of that place, so I just said thank you, signed the papers, and left. The rest of the trip was great, and we had an amazing time at the resort. I'm glad my fiancé had the awareness to put the latch on the door that night, because without it, that man could have simply walked right in. And even with his family standing right there, he acted like a deranged lunatic, and I was preparing to attack him if he managed to get inside. Something horrible could have happened that night over a misunderstanding. Always be aware of your surroundings, and never compromise when it comes to your personal safety. This story goes way back to 1998, when I was 16 years old. I was hanging out with a couple of friends of mine, who I will call Ben and Jake. It was a late summer evening on a Saturday, and I was sitting in my room listening to some 80s rock albums, as teenagers would normally do back then. After a while, I got bored and went outside to meet up with my friends. We ended up chilling in Ben's garage, drinking beer and smoking pot. I can't remember exactly how, but we wound up walking down this narrow path by the woods and towards the lake. I guess we got bored of sitting around and went out to go do something. So back in '98, there was this popular hangout spot for teenagers in my neighborhood. So we were hoping to see some other kids there, but when we arrived, we were met with nothing but the sound of crickets. Bummer. So we sat on the bench for a while and just talked for about 15 minutes. Then Jake got the idea to go to an abandoned 2-story boathouse that was by the lake. We had nothing better to do, so we agreed. We soon entered the boathouse and started to explore. I just sort of stood there while Jake and Ben were going around breaking shit. I felt very uncomfortable, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that we were being watched. We went upstairs where there was an old wooden boat lying there with a fishing net over it. While checking it out, from downstairs we all heard the wooden door to the boathouse creak open. followed by heavy footsteps. We all froze in place and listened carefully. There was around a 5-second break when we heard a terrifying voice call out to us.
I know you're here. Come out, wherever you are.
The heavy footsteps started to walk towards the stairs as the old floorboards creaked and moaned. Jake went inside the wooden boat, and Ben and I followed. We put the fishing net over our heads and didn't move. The footsteps soon reached the top of the stairs.
I can hear you.
We were all as still as cadavers as we sat there and listened to this deranged person stumble around, looking for us. I contemplated a plan of escape without being caught, but there was just no way for the three of us to make it past him, and he was closing in on us. We were literally like sitting ducks. The man moved out of sight when he entered a small room adjacent to the boat. We suddenly ripped off the fishing net and made a break for it.
There you are,
the man said as he emerged from the room and rushed at Jake. But Jake reacted very quickly and shoved the man, sending him toppling over. We all ran like hell out of there and through the tall grass into the woods. We heard the man give chase, but he eventually gave up. We all went back to Ben's garage and fell onto the couch in exhaustion. Jake then told us that he saw a knife in the man's hand as he fell over. Ben and I sat there in utter shock. Did that fucking maniac really plan on killing us in that old boathouse? To this day, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened to us if Jake hadn't reacted so quickly? This story took place many years ago. I grew up in a pretty small neighborhood, and I pretty much knew everyone who lived around me. Our house was at the very end of the street. At the other end was a popular park that everyone, especially children, went to. My sister loved to go on walks very late at night and would usually go to the swing set at the park and swing there for a while because nobody else would be around to bother her. The park layout had the playground next to a path that led into a wooded area, with the only light source coming from a building next to the swing set. One night, maybe around 1 or 2 a.m., my sister walked down to the park. She was swinging for maybe about 10 minutes when she felt something was wrong. It was that unmistakable feeling you get when you feel like you're being watched. She didn't think much of it until this random guy seemed to come out of nowhere and sat on the swing next to her. This stranger kept trying to make conversation. He kept asking her if she lived around the park and how old she was. Around this time, my sister was 18 or 19 years old and was fairly small, and she looked a lot younger for her age. She didn't want to be around the swings anymore, so she texted me, telling me to call her. I was very confused, but I could just tell that something was wrong. I called her, and she picked up very quickly. I asked her what was going on. "Oh, you need me home? I'll be there right away." This further confused me. I could then hear her telling someone that she had to go. As soon as she walked far enough away, she explained everything to me. She walked up the concrete steps that led into the parking lot, and before she crossed the street, she looked back, and to her absolute horror, she noticed 3 other figures had emerged out of the woods. Each seemed to be carrying some sort of weapon. She immediately turned back and ran home, turning a 2-minute walk into 30 seconds. She slammed the door shut and locked it immediately as soon as she got back. My sister doesn't scare easy, but this was one of the only times I had ever seen her truly frightened. I don't like thinking about what would have happened if she didn't leave that situation when she did. She was mere seconds away from being ambushed. After that night, she no longer went on her late walks to the park and now always carries a pocket knife for her protection. So I used to live in a little town in north central Florida on 3.5 acres of wooded land with very high canopies. So high, in fact, the moonlight wouldn't shine through. so the property was always very dark at night. Abnormally dark. Before I bought the place, the property's previous owner had shared a piece of morbid history with me. There had once been a trailer out front where an old lady used to live. I guess she owned the land originally. One evening she was pressure canning when the cooker that she was using suffered a catastrophic explosion that severely injured the lady. Apparently she laid there for quite a while before she died. You could still see the foundation where the trailer was parked. After moving in, I've had some bad run-ins with the neighbors. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I've always felt a negative energy there in general. At the front of the property, opposite where the old trailer used to be, there was a long driveway that led up to a workshop. It was about 2,000 square feet or so, with 2 roll-up metal bay doors on its west side and a regular door facing the south, towards the house. The workshop had very high fluorescent lights and was outlined with shelves and cabinets, with a rectangular wood bracket for a television. There was also shelving high up in the corners where you could mount speakers. I spent a lot of time in there alone. The isolation always creeped me out a bit, but this was my workshop. This is where I got things done. The property's previous owner, the guy who told me about the old lady, used to work on motorcycles in there, so it was already set up as a mechanical repair shop. The building was roughly 10 meters or so from the house. It was around July of 2012. I was working in the shop. The doors were closed because it had been a rainy month, and I was trying to keep my tools from rusting, unsuccessfully, mind you. I was in the middle of cleaning this antique revolver. I had probably been in there for about an hour when suddenly, lightning struck close by. It startled me. I waited for about 5 minutes to see if it would pass. A little joke about Florida: if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes or drive 5 miles. So as I was wrapping things up, lightning hits the shop directly, coming through the front and striking the concrete base. Bits of concrete and sand bounced off the side of my neck as I cringed. The lights went out, plunging the shop into complete darkness. I ran towards the door on the south end, which faced the house. I remember kicking it open with the revolver in my hand, as if I was going to take on the storm that would be standing there, represented as a violent and dangerous intruder wearing a trench coat. The true ruthlessness of the storm was now vividly displayed in front of me. The mist from the almost 3 inches of rain was rushing past me into the darkness of the now powerless workshop. I stood there frozen for a few minutes, wondering if I should run the 100 or so meters to the house. Another strike landed nearby, and I was out of there. Running through the rainfall with a revolver in my right hand, I immediately began to slosh into the knee-high water rapids that I hadn't noticed before. Water was rushing towards the front of the property, right past the shop, like an angry, overflowing creek. My pace was slowed by the floodwaters now crashing constantly against my legs. I thought to myself, in a period of time that I can only describe as microseconds, I'm holding a piece of iron, and I'm in knee-high water. As that thought passes through my mind, I get within 30 feet of the sliding glass doors of my house. Safety was within my grasp. I stepped out of the rushing water and onto the small concrete slab, which was a few inches elevated, as it had once been the foundation for the aforementioned trailer. Before I could even tell my brain to slow my body down, I slid into the accumulated 4 inches of water that was gathered in my yard. The clean revolver was now submerged in about 8 inches of black mud. The decline brought me straight to the doors. I was now completely soaked, covered in muddy water. Without hesitation, I rolled to my side, bringing my legs off the ground and onto the landing. I opened the sliding glass doors with my left hand and practically rolled onto the tiled kitchen floor. Not a moment later, lightning strikes again, hitting a pine tree not 6 feet from the doors. I was blinded by a white flash. A loud crash followed, which shook the entire house. I rose to my feet and slammed the muddy revolver onto the countertop, then ran towards the staircase, which ran up the wall and led up to an upstairs loft. As a side note, I would never just leave my firearm on the counter in my kitchen, but my kids were at school at the time and my wife was at work. Considering the circumstances, I made my choice. Under the staircase was a large desk, where the family computer used to be. I decided to take refuge there until the storm passed. Within seconds, lightning hits the house. Another blinding flash enveloped my eyesight. My arms and legs seized up and locked straight down. I contorted into the shape of a human sausage link. The desk was only a few feet from the kitchen. The lightning had traveled through the exhaust pipe of our wood stove and struck the floor tiles, causing them to explode. At that moment, I became convinced of something, which I'll get into later. After diving under the desk, I quickly began to remove everything metallic I had on me. My wallet, my steel-toe boots, my watch, and my belt. I even removed my wedding ring and tossed it into the living room. Every muscle in my body was on fire. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't breathe. I imagine it was because of all the adrenaline rushing through me. I lay there and started to shiver. It took what felt like forever for the lightning to fade, and for the storm to subside. Later on, while surveying the damage with my wife, we discovered that our phone cords had been blown straight out of the walls, and charred bits of tile were found upstairs, and even on the bed in the loft. Now, before I wrap up this story, I'll share another experience that sort of foreshadowed what happened to me that day. It was about 10 years prior. I picked up this hitchhiker walking down the side of the road one day on my way home from work. I don't recommend picking up hitchhikers, by the way. But this guy had a severe limp, and he looked like he was in a lot of pain. It was very difficult for him to stand on one of his legs. It was like he couldn't bend his knees at all. As he got into the van, he started talking to me, almost shouting. He informed me that his hearing was impaired, and he appreciated me for being a good Samaritan and picking him up. Apparently his truck had run out of gas and he asked me to drop him off at the nearest gas station. No big deal. Somehow the conversation got on to why he was deaf. He told me that he had been struck by lightning one day when he was coming home from work. He lived in an apartment complex that had a 2-level parking garage. He was on the 2nd level when lightning came through the concrete roof and straight down his left leg. As a result, he lost his hearing. His left knee was severely damaged, and several of his vertebrae were now fused together, which is why he was walking the way he was. After I dropped him off, I never thought about this guy again for many years. But after my own close call with lightning, I remembered something that he said before he exited my van. Lightning always chooses who it hits. It seeks people out, and sometimes it even gets people more than once. I've had quite a few years to reflect on the situation, and I still have a hard time not believing that. Whenever lightning starts up again, I get uncontrollable anxiety. I know that I'm not safe anywhere. I hope you have a good night, and stay safe. This happened to me when I was in 5th grade. I was a safety patrol. My job was to assist the 1st grade teacher dismiss the kids for the day. After I was done, I would usually go to the other side of the school, where there was a library, and I would wait there with my brother for our parents to come pick us up. To better understand what happened that day, I have to explain the layout of getting to the library from my school. I would come out of the side and walk over to a fence that separates the school from the library. There was a bush with a small space that I would usually use as a shortcut, as opposed to walking the length of the fence to get to the front entrance. When I was done helping the teacher, there was mostly nobody left in school. I was always the last one to leave, as I'm the only safety patrol who isn't picked up from school. As I approached the aforementioned shortcut, I heard a movement from somewhere nearby. And soon, a figure emerged. It was a tall, skinny man, staring at me with this crazy look in his eyes. The man appeared to be severely disheveled, as if he had just taken a nap inside of a dumpster. I was a bit freaked out because he seemed to appear out of nowhere. I started walking faster. I then heard running footsteps coming right towards me. Without looking, I began running. I made it to the bush where the shortcut was, and I forced my way through. I got a few scratches in the process, but I was still running. I finally looked behind me and saw the deranged man struggling as he made his way through the bushes. Since I was smaller, it was a lot easier for me. The man ended up getting stuck and was out of breath. I used this opportunity to make my way into the library. As soon as I was inside, I hid behind my brother, who was on the computer. He was too occupied to see that I was in a panic. The man soon appeared outside of the front doors and then made his way inside. He then began searching the aisles of books, looking for me. He turned and made direct eye contact with me, but quickly noticed my brother, who was still staring at the computer screen. The man then saw that there was other people in the library. He then flashed me a hateful look, then left. After he was gone, I told my brother everything, but he didn't believe a word of it and went back to playing on the computer. In hindsight, I now know that I should have just told someone besides my brother right when it happened, maybe a library employee or the nearest adult. When my parents came to pick us up, I told them what happened. My parents were shocked and immediately told the librarian. She picked up the phone and called the police. They arrived soon after and interviewed me. The next day I had a meeting with a safety patrol group, and they were surprised because this school was considered one of the safest in the county. My mother was furious, and she told them from that day forward, a teacher would have to supervise me when I walked over to the library. A couple of days later, I was called into the head office during the school day. Some detectives came in to show me some surveillance footage from the library. They told me that they were doing everything they could to find the man. A kidnapper on school grounds is something that law enforcement does not mess around with, especially when the word gets out and other parents hear about it. A couple of days later, I was in the library again, waiting for my parents to come pick up my brother and I. I was reading a magazine, and I looked up, and I saw that same man. My blood ran cold. It was the same guy. I'll never forget his face as long as I live. He looked normal this time, and had a young girl with him. She wasn't acting like she was afraid of him or anything. I think she may have been his daughter. After the two of them left, I informed the librarian, who made a note of it. I haven't seen the man since that day, and we haven't got any updates from the police. Whoever he was, he either has an evil twin who tries to kidnap kids, or he lives a double life. A loving family man by day, child kidnapper by night. The story I wish to share with you today isn't your typical story that you will hear on this channel. Stories on this channel often regale us with situations of stalkers and other horrors, of how the victims in these stories nearly made it out alive. What we never hear, though, is the stalker's side of the story. If you were to pin an element of horror to my story, it would be that of a ruined reputation caused by exaggerated harms from a supposed victim. Being falsely accused of something should scare anybody, but we never stop to consider that there are two sides to every situation. Now, don't get me wrong. I think stalking is wrong. I think every person has the right to feel safe and unannoyed. I also feel that if a person is accused of something, they have a right to defend his or her actions. You may think, why don't you just get a lawyer and fight it? Well, it's just not that simple. Lawyers are expensive, public defenders are overworked, and also, many states have broad stalking laws, where even if you send somebody polite messages, they can interpret that as stalking. My nightmare begins in 2019. As a little preface, I have a very visible disability. Meeting women is hard for me. Despite my challenges, I still put myself out there, and I try to talk with people online and in person. I can't quite tell you how I came across her, but this girl, whom I will call Brooke, was on my people that I may know list on Instagram. Although I didn't know her, I wanted to. I sent her some polite messages, and she emailed me back, and thus we began our friendship. Soon our messages evolved into texting. She would tell me things about her, and I would tell her things about me. I honestly thought that we would start dating at some point, and this would be my first real relationship. Out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell on me that she was starting to see another guy. I was crushed. I couldn't believe it, but I remained cool, and I figured that being her friend was the next best thing. As time went on, her boyfriend became very hostile towards me, and they even broke up a few times. It was a mess. One day, through our messages, she relayed to me her struggles with mental health. She asked me if I ever thought of dying, and also told me about her past history with drug abuse. She also said that she kept having nightmares of an invisible man chasing her. I was honestly pretty spooked, but since I've dealt with issues of my own, I wasn't going to abandon her. I would be a hypocrite if I did that. We soon set in motion a plan of meeting up for her birthday. That's how close we were. But just like every good thing in life, it must come to an end. Nothing lasts forever. Brooke texted me one day and said very matter-of-factly, "The Holy Ghost doesn't give me good feelings about you." I was confused. Any normal person would have just ended it there, as that text would probably be a major red flag to anyone, but I have to admit that I was desperate. My pleas of trying to work it out with her didn't sway her, and she proceeded to block me. I am ashamed to admit it, but I have mental problems of my own, and I guess her blocking me caused me to have a breakdown. I tried emailing her, explaining how hurt I was, but she didn't reply. I was devastated. I would stay up at night hoping that she would respond, but she never did. I know at this point in the story I probably sound like an obsessed loser, but I still feel that my actions were not that of a stalker, because I never threatened her, nor did I do anything that would cause fear. I was simply trying to work out a problem. Isn't that what people who are in friendships are supposed to do? Also, with my disability, making connections is hard, so I was trying my best to hold on to what I felt was a valuable connection in my life, and she never explicitly told me to stop. Now, I must be clear, I wasn't messaging her every day. At most, I messaged her every other week. Suddenly, after 3 months, Brooke finally said something. Instead of telling me what happened or what was wrong, she flatly said to stop. I was so confused. All I wanted was an explanation. I wanted to know where things went wrong. After a few polite messages of questioning her, trying to uncover some answers, I finally got the hint, and I left her alone. I sat by myself and pondered the future. It was time for me to move on. I had gotten the response I wanted, and she told me to stop, and I had to respect that. Unfortunately, that's not how things played out. Before I knew it, I had officers at my doorstep serving me with a criminal summons for the misdemeanor of stalking. I was absolutely floored. Sending messages, trying to work something out, is now cyber stalking? I couldn't believe it. I immediately got an attorney and scoured through all of my email communications to her and gave them to my lawyer. He looked over the evidence and couldn't believe that I was being charged with stalking. In the months that followed, hearings were held over Zoom. Brooke gave a brief testimony and twisted the events of what actually happened. I tried sharing my version of events, but the judge simply would not listen. Every day felt like a haze. I had never been in trouble in my life before. Trolls that harassed me online began to spread the rumor that I was a stalker. They would send me emails and taunt me for my current predicament. I was the one being harassed. Slowly, my confidence died. I didn't know if I would ever be able to talk to anyone again, if I would even say hi to another girl. Would she turn around and lie and say that I was stalking her too? The prosecutor briefly considered dropping the charge, but was informed that I partake in vices that are legal in another state, and that changed his mind. He claimed that partaking in that recreation, even if it was legal, gave him an insight into my character. This nightmare just kept getting worse and worse. Now my personal life was being used against me. What was he gonna do next? Use my eating habits against me too? As the situation spiraled out of control, I had to make a hard choice, and I ended up pleading guilty to the misdemeanor charge. People automatically think that if someone pleads guilty, then they really must be. I think people who have that perspective have never actually been in a situation like I was. When you're up against the state, it's really hard to do anything other than plead guilty. They essentially have you in a chokehold and place your feet against the fire. I felt dirty pleading guilty because I knew I was innocent, but I felt that it was the only way that I would ever be able to move on with my life. 2 years have passed since this incident. I know that throughout the story it may seem like I was deflecting blame. I 100% admit that I was annoying at most, but I disagree that my actions were criminal though. Just imagine if we charged every single person on Facebook who messaged another person multiple times or did other annoying conduct. Our jails would be overbooked, more so than they already are now. I'm not going to share where this took place, but I will say that it took place in a city whose population is about 100,000. They have a large roster of people being charged. I think they do this on purpose and make it a game of ruining people's lives because the police and city attorneys have quotas they have to meet. As I said at the beginning, this wasn't your typical story. This story is scary in another way. Any one of us could be charged at any moment, and our lives turned upside down, and our reputations ruined forever, all based on lies. Never once did a police officer or city official reach out to me and ask for my side of the story. They decided just to charge me because they didn't like me. It's absolutely frightening to think about how many people are in prison for alleged crimes based on exaggerated claims. Next time you hear a story of someone being accused of something, I strongly advise you to stop and perhaps consider their side of the story as well, before you start judging them. This story happened in the fall of 2009, when I was in my senior year of high school. I grew up in a small suburb in Utah, and I've played football for my entire life. As a senior, I was the captain of the team, and our stadium was near the center of town. When this all started, we were playing our second home game on a cloudy Saturday evening. I had scored both of our team's touchdowns up to that point, and we had held the other team scoreless. Midway through the third quarter, one of the kids on the other team started throwing punches at me and cursing. I ignored it and walked away, but the referee still kicked us both out of the game, much to the dismay of our head coach, who I will call Coach Joe for this story. After I was ejected, Coach Joe reluctantly sent me back to the locker room. So I started the long walk under the stands to our locker room, but when I got there, the door was wide open. This was unusual, since Coach Joe usually locked it when we went out on the field. I wasn't really concerned about it though. After about an hour, the rest of the team got back in the locker room. It was a blowout. We won 27-6. We celebrated for a while, then everyone left except for me and two of the other captains, Ryan and Mason. Coach Joe called me into his office to tell me that he thought my ejection was a bad call. He was proud of me for walking away from the kid. After he finished, I asked him if he locked the door after halftime and explained to him that it was open when I got back. He was confused, but we both kinda blew it off. Fast forward to Wednesday. All week, there had been an increased police presence and search helicopters everywhere 24/7 because a young girl from the town next to ours had been missing since Saturday night. Before practice that day, there was a putrid stench in the locker room. It was the same thing the day after as well. We all figured that it was just our sweaty clothes making the smell. That's almost always the reason that locker rooms smell bad in general. After our Friday night game, Coach Joe told us to take home all of our stuff and wash it, and that he was having someone come to the stadium to fumigate the locker room as he did once a month. So we took everything home, but the smell was still there when we went to practice the next morning. We were able to put up with it for a bit, but eventually it got to be too much, and every inch of the locker room smelled like a sewer. It was so bad about 10 of my teammates had gotten sick from it, along with 3 of the assistant coaches. That week, we had another home game. We were in what was usually our guest locker room, which smelled like perfume in comparison, while our opponents were behind the snack shack. We ended up losing this game, 17-3. Coach Joe told us that we were off for the weekend, but that he wanted me, Ryan, and Mason to help him find the smell in the locker room. So we met him there around 5 in the afternoon and started looking. We looked around for about an hour, and we couldn't find the source of the horrid smell. There was nowhere left to look, except for in the ceiling. We didn't think it could be there, but Coach Joe had me check anyways as a last-ditch effort. Mason grabbed a ladder from the team closet, and I climbed up. I moved one of the tiles out of the way and stuck my head in. After shining a flashlight around for a bit, I saw a small black bag within arm's reach. It was then that I remembered the whole thing about the missing girl. How she went missing the same day that the locker room door was left open, and everything came together. I was already starting to feel pretty sick. I was more nauseous than I thought was even possible. "What is it?" Coach Joe asked. I reached for the bag. What I saw when I pulled it open will be forever imprinted in my mind. I saw the decapitated head of the missing girl. Her hair was mangled. Her skin was black and red. Her eyes were sunken into her sockets. Ryan fainted, and Coach Joe threw up right there in front of us. I dropped the bag and ran. When we were able to collect ourselves, we called the police and an ambulance for Ryan, since he was still passed out. The police were able to confirm that the head did in fact belong to the missing girl. The rest of her body was never found. A couple of weeks later, they arrested a 28-year-old man that confessed to killing her, as well as some other things that are just too disgusting for me to mention. I'll leave it up to your imagination. How he was able to sneak around so well while the game was going on is beyond me. I can't imagine the fear and pain that that girl went through in the last few hours of her life. The crazy thing is, we were all joking about the possibility of there being a body hidden somewhere in the locker room, causing the horrible smell. Little did we know how right we were. It's been years since then, and it's still hard for me to comprehend that there was a human head decomposing above us in the locker room for 2 weeks.